Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't believe what happened that morning. July 16th, 2014. The date is burned into my brain forever. It's been nearly 10 years, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. I've tried to talk about it with people, but unless you've seen one yourself, you just get those looks. You know the ones, where they smile and nod, but their eyes say they think you're completely nuts. I guess I should start by saying I carpool to work with my friend Nikki. We both work at the same hospital in the billing department, and we've been carpooling for about 3 years now. That morning was Nikki's turn to drive. I remember it was a Wednesday, because we were both complaining about how the week was dragging on. My alarm went off at 4:30 that morning. I hate getting up that early, but our shift starts at 6, and we have about a 30-minute commute. I remember feeling extra tired that day. I'd stayed up late the night before watching some stupid reality show, and I was definitely regretting it as I dragged myself into the shower. Nikki texted me at 5:15 to say she was outside. I grabbed my travel mug of coffee, kissed my husband goodbye, he was still half asleep, and headed out the door. It was still dark outside, that deep pre-dawn darkness where everything feels quiet and still. The air was cool and damp, typical July morning in our area. When I got into Nikki's car, she already had the radio on low, some morning talk show, and she looked about as tired as I felt. We exchanged our usual morning greetings and complaints about being up so early, and then we were off. We take Eaton Road to work because it's the quickest route, even though parts of it are pretty isolated. There's this bridge that crosses over the Mad River about halfway through our drive. The road narrows a bit there, with dense woods on both sides. The river itself isn't particularly big, but it's deep in some spots, and the currents can be strong. We were both quiet. That morning, still trying to wake up. Nikki had her high beams on since it was so dark, and we were the only car on the road at that hour. I remember looking at the dashboard clock right before it happened. It was 5:25 exactly. We were approaching the Mad River Bridge when Nikki suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly, and my coffee sloshed over the edge of my travel mug onto my pants. "What the?" I started to say, annoyed about my coffee, but then I saw it. This thing had just stepped out onto the road in front of us. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, just absolutely massive. It appeared on the right side of the road, coming up from the riverbank, and was crossing to the left side. The high beams caught it full on, and I'll never forget how it raised its arm, its impossibly long, hairy arm, up to shield its eyes from the light. That movement was so human. But there was nothing human about this creature. It had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe taller, and it was hunched over slightly. If it had stood up straight, I can't even imagine how tall it would have been. Its body was enormous, solid, with shoulders that seemed to be twice as wide as a normal man's. I remember thinking it had to weigh at least 400 pounds, maybe 500. The fur, or hair, I don't know what to call it, was a dark brown color, almost like wet coffee grounds. On the arm it raised, the hair was long, hanging down maybe 4 or 5 inches. It moved with purpose, not rushing but not slow either, just deliberately crossing the road in front of us. The weird thing is, even though it had clearly come up from the river, its lower half didn't seem wet at all. The fur wasn't matted or dripping like you'd expect. I remember thinking that was strange, even in the moment. Nikki and I sat there frozen. The whole encounter probably only lasted 7 or 8 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. Neither of us said a word. I couldn't even breathe. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. As it reached the left side of the road, it disappeared into the tree line, just gone, like it had never been there at all. Nikki and I sat there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Finally, I turned to look at her. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and she was as pale as I've ever seen her. "Did you?" she whispered, not finishing the sentence. "Yeah," I said. My voice sounded strange, too high. "I saw it." "That was a Bigfoot," she said. Not a question, a statement. I nodded, still in shock. "I've seen one before," I admitted. Nikki turned to me, her eyes wide. "So have I," she said. "A few years ago, up near Willow Creek. I never told anyone because I thought they'd think I was crazy." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "Mine was back in '85, I told her. "Right here, actually, not far from this spot." I had never told anyone about my previous encounter except my husband, and even he had been skeptical. But now, sitting in that car with Nikki, I felt a strange sense of validation. My first sighting had been in the spring of '85, March or April, I can't remember exactly. I was driving to my early shift at the diner where I worked back then. It was about 5 in the morning, maybe 5:30, still dark out. I was on Old Mill Road, which runs parallel to some railroad tracks, when I saw something moving along those tracks. At first I thought it was a bear. It was on all fours, moving quickly. But then it stopped, and in one fluid motion it stood up on 2 legs. I'll never forget watching that transformation, from animal to something else entirely. It stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, then turned and walked away on 2 feet, disappearing into the trees. I told Nikki all of this as we sat there in her idling car, still parked in the middle of Eaton Road. When I finished, she started driving again, slowly at first, then picking up speed as we crossed the bridge. "I can't believe this," she kept saying. "I can't believe we both saw it." We spent the rest of the drive to work discussing what we'd seen, comparing details, confirming with each other that yes, it had really happened. By the time we pulled into the hospital parking lot, we'd made a pact to go online after work and see if there had been other sightings in the area. The workday was a blur. I kept replaying the image of that creature in my mind, the way it moved, the size of it, that incredibly human gesture of raising its arm to shield its eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it. That evening, Nikki came over to my house, and we spent hours searching online for similar reports. We found several accounts from our county dating back decades. Some of them matched our experiences so closely it gave me chills. People described the same height, the same brown fur, the same deliberate movement. One thing that really stuck with me was learning about how Bigfoot is often spotted near water sources. That made sense with both of my encounters. The first near the railroad tracks that run alongside a creek, and this one coming directly from the Mad River. It's been nearly 10 years now, and I've become something of an amateur researcher on the subject. I've learned that early morning hours, especially around 5 to 5:30 a.m., are common times for sightings. I've heard theories about them being nocturnal, about them using waterways to travel undetected, about them having territories they patrol. I've never seen one again, though I've gone back to that bridge countless times, always hoping for another glimpse. Nikki and I still carpool, and we always slow down when we cross the Mad River Bridge, scanning the banks on both sides. Some people have suggested we mistook a bear for Bigfoot. All I can say to that is, I know what a bear looks like. This was not a bear. The proportions were all wrong. The long arms, the broad shoulders, the height. And bears don't shield their eyes from headlights. Others have suggested we were tired and hallucinating. But we both saw exactly the same thing, down to the smallest detail. How do two people share the same hallucination? The truth is, I don't know what we saw that morning. I just know that it was real, it was massive, and it changed how I look at the woods forever. Every time I drive past a densely forested area now, especially near water, I can't help but scan the tree line. I wonder how many of them are out there, watching us from the shadows, carefully staying just out of sight. Sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I replay that moment in my mind, the creature stepping onto the road, raising its arm, crossing with that purposeful stride. What was it thinking? Was it as startled by us as we were by it? Where was it going? Where had it come from? I may never have those answers, but I know what I saw on July 16th, 2014, at 5:25 in the morning on the Mad River Bridge. And no amount of skepticism or rational explanation will ever convince me otherwise. If you've seen something similar, please share your story. There are more of us out there than you might think. And sometimes, knowing you're not alone is the most comforting thing of all. Story 2. I've been debating for weeks whether to share this. Part of me feels ridiculous even typing it out, but I need to tell someone who might understand or have experienced something similar. This happened 3 years ago, but I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about it. My ex-husband Mark and I were still married back then. We'd been having problems for a while, but when his grandfather passed away, we sort of put our issues on hold. The old man had lived alone in this cabin in Waterford, Vermont for decades after his wife died. Mark was his only living relative, so we had to drive up there to clean out the place and get it ready to sell. The drive to Vermont was actually nice, one of those rare, peaceful moments between us. We talked about normal stuff, listened to podcasts, and for once didn't argue. It was early October, and the fall colors were incredible. I remember thinking maybe this trip would help us reconnect. But that feeling evaporated the moment we pulled up to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon. It was way more isolated than Mark had described. The gravel driveway seemed to stretch forever through dense woods before opening to a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was a typical log cabin, but something felt off immediately. The porch sagged on one side, and there were boards haphazardly nailed over parts of the roof. "I thought you said your grandfather kept this place up well," I said as we got out of the car. Mark looked confused. "He did, last time I was here, but that was probably 5 years ago." The front door was locked with 3 separate deadbolts, which struck me as excessive for a cabin in the middle of nowhere. When Mark finally got the door open, the smell hit us, musty and stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in years. I walked in first and stopped dead in my tracks. The interior looked like something from a horror movie about a paranoid survivalist. There were holes in the ceiling, not from decay, but what looked like bullet holes. Mark's grandfather had apparently been shooting at the ceiling. About a dozen buckets were strategically placed throughout the living room, catching water drips from the damaged roof. But it was the knives and sharp objects that really freaked me out. There were knives stuck into the wooden beams of the walls. Scissors, letter openers, and even sharpened sticks were positioned on windowsills and near the doors, all pointing outward like weapons ready for use. "What the hell was your grandfather doing up here?" I whispered. Mark just stood there, shaking his head. "I don't know. Mom always said he got weird after Grandma died, but this is not what I expected." We spent the next few hours trying to make the place livable for the weekend. I cleaned while Mark examined some of his grandfather's belongings. We found notebooks filled with illegible scribbles and strange drawings. Most pages had the same phrase written over and over: "They're on the roof." There were crude sketches of what looked like tall, skinny figures. "He must have had dementia," Mark said, closing one of the notebooks. My mom mentioned he refused to see doctors in his last years. By nightfall, we'd cleared enough space to set up our sleeping bags in the living room. The bedroom was too cluttered with junk, and honestly, the whole place gave me the creeps. I wanted to suggest we find a motel, but we were at least 30 minutes from the nearest town, and I could tell Mark was troubled by what we'd found. He wanted to stay, to understand what had happened to his grandfather. We heated up some canned soup on the old stove and ate in silence. The only light came from a battery-powered lantern we'd brought, since the electricity was spotty at best. Outside, the woods were pitch black. No streetlights, no neighbors, Nothing but darkness beyond the windows. "We should get some sleep," Mark finally said. "Tomorrow we can start sorting through everything properly." I nodded, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump. I kept looking at those holes in the ceiling, wondering what had driven an old man to shoot at his own roof. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I dozed off around 11. I'm not sure how long I slept before the first noise woke me. Footsteps. Clear as day. There were footsteps on the roof above us. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. "Mark!" I whispered, shaking him awake. "There's someone on the roof." He listened for a moment, and then we both heard it. Again, the unmistakable sound of something moving across the cabin roof. Not just walking, but almost scampering. "Probably raccoons," Mark said, but his voice had that tight quality it gets when he's trying to sound calm. "Or maybe a bear. Let me check." Before I could stop him, he grabbed the flashlight and one of his grandfather's knives from the wall. I followed him to the door, clutching my phone, ready to call for help, though I doubted police could reach us quickly out here. As soon as Mark opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the noises changed. What had been cautious movement suddenly turned into a frenzy. It sounded like multiple animals running back and forth across the roof, their claws scraping against the wood. The whole cabin seemed to shake. Mark pointed the flashlight up at the roof, but couldn't see anything from our angle. "Hey!" he shouted. "Get out of here!" That's when we heard it. A scream that made every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, not a coyote or a fox or anything natural. It was high-pitched, but somehow guttural at the same time, like something trying to mimic a human scream without quite getting it right. The sound physically disoriented me. I felt dizzy, and Mark stumbled backward into me. We both froze, unable to move for several seconds while the scream hung in the air. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost worse. The roof noises had ceased completely. Mark grabbed my arm and pulled me back inside, locking the door behind us. "What the fuck was that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Before he could answer, we heard a new sound, something moving around the cabin, circling it. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the dirt outside. Not an animal on four legs. These were bipedal steps, heavy and measured. We moved to the window, and Mark cautiously pulled back the curtain just enough for us to peek out. The moonlight was bright enough to see the clearing around the cabin, but at first, I didn't spot anything. Then something moved at the edge of the woods. I thought it was a tree at first. That's how tall it was. But then it stepped forward into the moonlight, and I had to clap my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. It was humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. It stood easily 7 feet tall, with limbs too long and too thin for its body. Its skin was a sickly grayish color that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. But its face, God, its face is what still haunts my nightmares. It had pronounced cheekbones that jutted out unnaturally from its face, and its mouth was filled with teeth that looked almost blocky, like they'd been crudely carved from bone. As we watched in horror, 2 more emerged from the woods. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking toward the cabin. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away as they approached the windows. One of them pressed its face against the glass just a few feet from where we stood. Its eyes were dark hollows, but somehow I could feel it looking directly at me. Its expression wasn't aggressive. It was curious, almost childlike, but that somehow made it more terrifying. It tapped on the glass with long, spindly fingers that had too many joints. "The gun," Mark whispered suddenly. "Where's my grandfather's gun?" I remembered seeing a shotgun mounted above the fireplace earlier. Mark moved slowly toward it while I kept my eyes on the creatures. They were at every window now, peering in, watching us like we were animals in a zoo. Then I heard one of them at the door. The doorknob rattled as something tried to turn it. Thank God for those multiple locks. Another one started tapping rhythmically on a window like it was trying to communicate or distract us. Mark had the shotgun now, checking if it was loaded. "It's empty," he said, his voice breaking. "There's no ammunition." The tapping at the windows became more insistent, and the doorknob rattling turned into pounding. The creatures were making that awful screaming noise again, but softer now, almost like they were talking to each other. I was backing away from the windows when I heard a crash from the kitchen. One of them had broken through the back door. Mark grabbed the largest knife from the wall and pushed me behind him as we heard it entering the cabin. The floorboards creaked under its weight as it moved through the kitchen toward us. When it appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, I thought I might pass out from terror. It was hunched over to fit under the doorframe, but still towered over us. Its limbs seemed to bend in impossible ways as it moved, and that face, that horrible face, was now just feet away from us. Mark lunged forward with the knife, slashing wildly at the creature. It made a sound like air escaping from a balloon and recoiled, more surprised than hurt. Dark fluid oozed from a shallow cut on its arm. I had my phone out, frantically dialing 911 while backing toward the front door. The operator's voice seemed to come from a million miles away as I screamed about intruders at the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to describe what they really looked like. The creature recovered from its surprise and moved toward Mark again. Two more were trying to force their way through the front windows now, the glass cracking under their pressure. Mark kept slashing with the knife, keeping the creature at bay, but unable to drive it back. I grabbed one of the lanterns and hurled it at the thing. It struck its chest and shattered, spilling oil that immediately caught fire. The creature let out a deafening scream that seemed to shake the entire cabin. It backed away, the flames spreading across its body, illuminating its grotesque form in flickering orange light. The sight of it fully illuminated was somehow worse than the shadows. The other creatures outside responded to their burning companion with those same horrible screams. The one on fire crashed back through the kitchen and out the broken door, leaving a trail of small fires in its wake. Mark grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the front door. "We have to get to the car," he said, "but the others, they're distracted by the fire. It's our only chance." He was right. The remaining creatures had moved toward the back of the cabin where their burning companion had fled. We unlocked the front door and ran for the car, not daring to look back. Mark's hands were shaking so badly he could hardly get the key in the ignition. I kept watching the cabin, terrified the creatures would emerge at any moment. When the engine finally started, he floored it, sending gravel flying as we sped down the driveway. We drove straight to the police station in the nearest town. The officers there clearly thought we were crazy or on drugs. They sent a patrol car to check the cabin, but found nothing except the small fires we'd started, which they managed to extinguish before they spread to the woods. According to their report, there were signs of animal activity, but no evidence of the creatures we described. They suggested bears, or even people in costumes trying to scare us away from the property. Mark and I barely spoke on the drive home. What could we say? We both knew what we'd seen, but we processed it differently. He became obsessed with researching local legends and cryptids, convinced we could identify what had attacked us. I just wanted to forget it had ever happened. Our marriage didn't survive. The experience broke something between us that couldn't be fixed. He couldn't let it go, and I couldn't stand to be reminded of it. We divorced 6 months later. I still don't know what we saw that night. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just bears or some other logical explanation. But then I remember those faces pressed against the glass, those two long fingers tapping, those inhuman screams, and I know better. Mark went back to the cabin alone last year. He said he needed answers. When he returned, he wouldn't tell me what he found, just that his grandfather hadn't been crazy after all. We haven't spoken since. I moved to the city after the divorce. I need the noise, the light, the constant presence of other people. And I never ever sleep in places where I can hear what might be walking on the roof. Story 3. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. Even now, I hesitate to write it down because I know how it sounds. But after 18 years, I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I need to get this off my chest. This happened back in May of 2004. My friend Jake and I had been planning a short getaway to Mount St. Helens for months. We both lived in Portland at the time, and even though the volcano was practically in our backyard, neither of us had ever really explored the area properly. Jake was always more outdoorsy than me, but I loved hiking and was excited about the trip. We booked this tiny cabin in the backcountry through the Forest Service. It was super basic, just 4 walls, some bunks, a table and a wood stove. No electricity, no running water. The outhouse was maybe 30 feet away down a little path. The reservation was dirt cheap, like $25 a night, which should have told us something about the amenities. When we arrived that Friday afternoon, I was actually blown away by how isolated it was. We had to drive about 2 miles down this unmarked dirt road, and the cabin itself was nestled in this deep ravine, surrounded by ridgelines, covered in these massive old Douglas firs and western hemlocks. The trees were enormous, some probably hundreds of years old. The whole place had this primal feel to it. We spent that day hiking. We explored some of the lava tubes near Ape Cave and trekked through this gorgeous old-growth forest. The weather was perfect, warm but not hot, clear, blue skies. By late afternoon we were pretty tired, so we headed back to the cabin. Jake grilled some burgers on the fire pit outside while I unpacked the wine I'd brought, a cheap Cabernet, but it tasted amazing after all that hiking. That evening was actually one of the most peaceful moments I can remember. We sat on these rickety wooden chairs on the narrow porch, drinking wine from plastic cups, watching the sunset through the trees. The forest was so alive, birds calling, squirrels chattering, and as it got darker, frogs and crickets started their nighttime symphony. We talked about everything and nothing, work stuff, relationships, future plans. By 11, we were both exhausted and turned in. The cabin had 2 separate bunks on opposite walls. I took the one by the small window and Jake crashed on the other side. I remember falling asleep almost immediately, listening to the chorus of frogs and insects outside. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My phone was dead and I hadn't brought a charger. What was the point without electricity? But it had to be around midnight or 1 in the morning. What struck me immediately was the silence, the absolute complete silence. No frogs, no insects, nothing. Just this oppressive stillness that felt wrong somehow. I laid there for a few minutes trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. This sound coming from somewhere in the hills. It's so hard to describe. It wasn't exactly a howl, but it wasn't a scream either. It was this high-pitched yet somehow deep vocalization that started low and rose up at the end, almost like a question. It echoed through the ravine, bouncing off the ridgelines. At first I thought maybe it was a coyote or something, but I've heard coyotes before. This was different, completely different. The call came again, 3 or 4 times in succession, and I realized it was closer now. Whatever was making that sound was moving toward our cabin. I sat up in my bunk and whispered, "Jake, you awake?" He didn't respond, just kept breathing deeply, completely out cold. I considered shaking him awake but hesitated. What would I even say? I heard a weird noise. He'd just tell me it was nothing and go back to sleep. The calls continued, always in these sets of 3 or 4, and always getting closer. Each time they sounded, my skin would prickle with goosebumps. There was something about the pitch and cadence that felt intelligent. That's the only way I can describe it. Not animal-like, despite the wildness of the sound. There was a pattern, a deliberateness to it. The cabin suddenly felt incredibly vulnerable. The walls were just basic timber, the door a simple latch. The window next to my bunk had no curtain, just a thin pane of glass looking out into the pitch-black forest. I remember staring into that darkness, straining to see anything moving out there. When the calls sounded again, they were close enough that I could hear subtle variations in the vocalizations, little inflections and changes in pitch that made them feel like some form of communication. The loudest one made me flinch. It had to be just a few 100 yards away now. I closed the window, even though the cabin was warm and stuffy. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latch. Jake was still sound asleep, completely oblivious. I envied him so much in that moment. For about 20 minutes the calls continued, sometimes seeming to circle around the cabin. I sat there frozen, barely breathing, afraid to make any noise. My bladder was getting uncomfortably full. We'd had quite a bit of wine, but there was no way I was going outside to the outhouse with whatever that was prowling around. Then, suddenly, the calls stopped. The silence returned, somehow even heavier than before. I sat there in the dark, waiting, listening. Nothing. After what felt like forever but was probably another 20 minutes, I couldn't hold it anymore. I had to use the outhouse. I slid off my bunk as quietly as possible, slipped on my shoes, and grabbed the small flashlight I'd brought. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I unlatched the door as slowly as I could, wincing at every tiny creak. The night air hit me like a wall, cool and damp against my skin. I flicked on the flashlight, keeping the beam pointed down at the dirt path. I was terrified of shining it into the trees, afraid of what I might see reflected back at me. The 30-foot walk to the outhouse felt like a mile. I kept hearing little sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but told myself it was just my imagination. The outhouse was this tiny wooden structure, barely big enough to turn around in. I rushed inside, latched the flimsy door, and did my business as quickly as humanly possible. The whole time, I was listening intently, my body tense and ready to... What? Run? Scream? I don't know. The walk back to the cabin was even worse. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for something to be waiting just off the path, watching me. By the time I made it back inside and secured the latch, I was trembling from head to toe. I climbed back into my bunk and pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin, staring at the ceiling. Sleep seemed impossible, but eventually, exhaustion won out. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the window and Jake was already up, boiling water on the wood stove for coffee. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said cheerfully. "You were out cold. I've been up for an hour." I told him about what happened, the strange calls, how they seemed to move around the cabin, how unnatural they sounded. He listened politely, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. "Probably just a dream," he said, handing me a cup of instant coffee. "Or maybe an owl. Some of them make weird noises." "It wasn't an owl, Jake," I insisted, "and it wasn't a dream. It was real." He shrugged. "Well, whatever it was, it's gone now. Want to hike up to the ridge today?" We spent the rest of the weekend without incident. No more strange calls in the night, no unexplained silences. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever we ventured into the trees. I was relieved when Sunday came and we packed up to leave. Life went on. I moved to Seattle for work a few months later. Jake and I drifted apart, as friends sometimes do. I dated, changed jobs, bought a condo. The incident at Mount St. Helens faded to the back of my mind, filed away under weird experiences. Then, about 3 years later, I was flipping through channels one night when I stumbled across a documentary called Sasquatch Legend Meets Science on the Discovery Channel. I almost changed the channel. I've never been big on cryptid stuff, but something made me keep watching. About halfway through, they started playing audio recordings. My blood ran cold. The sounds coming from my TV were identical to what I'd heard that night in the cabin. The same rising pitch, the same cadence, the same pattern of calls in groups of 3 or 4, the exact same eerie quality that had made my skin crawl. The researchers on the show were calling them Sasquatch vocalizations, recorded in remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. I sat there, completely stunned, as goosebumps rose on my arms. I've gone back and forth over the years about what I actually experienced that night. I'm not saying I heard a Bigfoot. I'm not saying that's even a real thing. But I know what I heard, and it wasn't any animal I recognize. It wasn't human, and it wasn't a dream. I've returned to the Mount St. Helens area many times since then. It's too beautiful to stay away, but I've never gone back to that specific cabin, and I've never camped alone. Whatever was out there that night, making those calls, moving through the darkness, I don't want to meet it face to face. Sometimes when I'm hiking in deep forest and the trail gets quiet, that unnatural quiet where all the birds and insects suddenly go silent, I get this crawling sensation up my spine. And I remember those calls echoing through the ravine, getting closer and closer in the darkness. Whatever it was real. And it's still out there somewhere in those ancient woods. Story 4. I still can't sleep through the night. It's been almost 10 years, and I still wake up drenched in sweat, hearing that ungodly scream in my dreams. My wife Lillian says I thrash around so violently sometimes that she's taken to sleeping in the spare room when my nightmares get bad. I don't blame her. What I saw in those mountains changed me forever. Back in November of 1923, I was making a decent living as a hunter and trapper in Arizona. Had been for almost 15 years. I knew those mountains like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. The Escadilla Range had always been good to me. Plenty of game, peaceful in its own way, until that November. It started with reports from local ranchers about cattle killings. Not your typical mountain lion or wolf attacks. These cows were torn apart, organs missing, but most of the meat left behind. Old man Harkins lost 3 prize bulls in a week. Said he found them with their rib cages splayed open like someone had pulled them apart with their bare hands. The ranchers were convinced it was a bear, a massive grizzly they'd taken to calling Clubfoot because of its unusual tracks. The county put up a bounty, $200, which was serious money back then. As one of the most experienced hunters in the area, I figured I'd try my luck. We needed the money, and honestly, I was curious. Something about the descriptions of the kills didn't sit right with me. Bears don't typically waste meat like that. The morning I left, I remember Lillian fussing over me more than usual. "Jake," she said, "you be careful out there. Something don't feel right about this one." I laughed it off, kissed her goodbye, and grabbed my Winchester. I'd packed supplies for 3 days, though I figured I'd track and kill the beast in 1 or 2 at most. I rode out at dawn, my horse Thunder steady beneath me. He was a good trail horse, calm in most situations, which is why what happened later scared me so badly. I headed up into the higher elevations of the Escadilla Range, following reports of where the beast had last been spotted. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached a prominent rock outcropping that gave me a good view of the surrounding area. The air was crisp, with that late autumn bite to it. I remember thinking the hunting conditions were perfect. Clear visibility, light wind carrying scents toward me rather than away. I tied Thunder to a tree and decided to scout the area on foot. That's when I found the kill site. And not just one kill, it was like some kind of grotesque collection. Under a stand of pines, partially covered with brush, were at least 6 carcasses in various states of decomposition. 2 deer, what looked like an elk, and 3 cattle. All mangled in the same way. Rib cages torn open, organs missing, but plenty of meat left on the bones. This wasn't normal bear behavior. Bears don't collect their kills. They either eat on the spot or drag a carcass to a secure location. They don't create graveyards. That's the only word I can think of to describe what I was looking at. It was like some twisted trophy collection. I was examining one of the fresher carcasses when Thunder started acting up. First just snorting and pawing at the ground, then full-on panicking, pulling at his tether and rolling his eyes. In 15 years of hunting with that horse, I'd never seen him spooked like that. Then I felt it. That sensation every outdoorsman knows. The feeling of being watched, The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly straightened, scanning the hillside above me. Thunder was going, crazy now, and I moved back toward him, drawing my rifle as I went. That's when I spotted movement on the ridge about 50 yards away. Just a flicker at first, something dark moving between the trees, too big to be a man. It wasn't moving like a bear, though. Bears lumber, they have a distinctive gait. This thing was, I don't know how to describe it, almost gliding but in a jerky way. Thunder finally broke his tether and bolted. Can't say I blame him. I was on my own now, with whatever this thing was between me and the way back down the mountain. I made a dash for a nearby cluster of boulders, figuring I'd have better protection with my back against something solid. From my new position, I could see it more clearly as it moved down the slope. It was big, easily 7 or 8 feet tall when it occasionally rose to its full height, covered in dark hair or fur, but not uniform like a bear's coat, patchy in places. And it didn't move on all fours consistently. Sometimes it would drop down, other times it would rise up in a way that looked almost human. I'm not ashamed to say I was terrified. Every instinct told me this wasn't any normal animal, not a bear, not a mountain lion, not anything I'd encountered in all my years in those mountains. It seemed to be following Thunder's trail, and I thought maybe I could slip away while it was distracted. But then it stopped, lifted its head, and turned directly toward my hiding spot. I swear to God, it knew exactly where I was. And then it started coming straight for me. I raised my Winchester and shouted, hoping to scare it off. It didn't even slow down. When it was about 30 yards away, I fired my first shot, hit it square in the chest. It should have dropped any normal animal. This thing barely flinched. I worked the lever action and fired again and again. 5 shots in total, all center mass. The thing just kept coming, moving faster now. I had 1 bullet left when it was less than 15 yards away, and I could see its face clearly for the first time. God help me, its face. Not a bear, not anything natural. Its eyes were set too far apart, its jaw too long, and its eyes, yellow and aware in a way no animal's eyes should be. They were intelligent eyes, hateful eyes. My last shot caught it in the throat, and finally, it reacted. Dark blood spurted from the wound, and it let out a scream that will haunt me until the day I die. It wasn't an animal sound. It started like a woman shrieking in pain, then deepened into something else, something that made my soul shrivel up inside me. It staggered backward, clutching at its throat, and in that moment, its movements were so human-like that I almost couldn't process what I was seeing. Then it turned and scrambled back up the hillside, moving faster than any man or beast I'd ever seen. I didn't wait around. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. Somehow, I made it down to the trail, and by some miracle found Thunder waiting nervously about a mile down the mountain. I jumped on his back and rode hard for Alpine, the nearest town. I went straight to Elias Morgan's place. Elias was an old Apache tracker who'd been living among white folks for decades. He had the best hunting dogs in 3 counties. More importantly, he knew things about the mountains that most people didn't. When I told him what I'd seen, he didn't laugh or call me crazy like I expected. He just got real quiet, then asked, "Did it scream like a woman dying?" My blood went cold. "How did you know that?" "Old stories," he said. "Very old. My grandfather spoke of them. They weren't supposed to be real." He agreed to come back with me the next day, bringing his 4 best dogs. We set out at first light, both of us armed to the teeth. I'd reloaded my Winchester and brought every bullet I owned. Elias carried his old Sharps rifle and a large knife at his belt. We found the rock outcropping easily enough, but the carcass collection was gone. Not a trace remained except for some blood-stained earth. We searched the area and found tracks. Not bear tracks, not human tracks, but something in between. The footprints were elongated, with what looked like 5 toes, but much larger than any man's foot. The dogs picked up the scent and led us deeper into the mountains, to an area I'd never explored before. The terrain got rougher, the forest darker and more dense. The whole time, I had that feeling again of being watched from every direction. The dogs led us to a thicket so dense we had to dismount and proceed on foot. They were getting agitated, growling and whining alternately. Elias whispered, "It's close." Suddenly, all 4 dogs charged into the thicket, barking furiously. What followed was, God, I can barely stand to remember it. The sounds of the dogs fighting, yelping in pain, and that scream again, that terrible, soul-destroying scream. Elias shouted something in Apache and charged in after his dogs. I called for him to stop, but he was already pushing through the brush. I heard him fire 1 shot, then a sound like wood cracking, then silence. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I gathered my courage and followed the path Elias had taken through the thicket. I found his rifle first. The barrel bent completely backward, the stock splintered in half like it was nothing more than a twig, no sign of the dogs. Then I heard whimpering from behind a fallen log. It was Elias. He was alive, curled up in a fetal position, shaking uncontrollably. When I turned him over, I nearly jumped out of my skin. His hair, which had been coal black that morning, was now completely white. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and he kept muttering the same phrase over and over. "Break the mountain. It's the only way to get rid of them." I practically carried him back to the horses. He never spoke another coherent word. We got back to Alpine, and I handed him over to the doctor, but there was nothing medically wrong with him. His mind was just gone. I never went back to those mountains, sold our place and moved Lillian and myself to California within a month. I never hunted again either. To this day, I don't know what I encountered up there. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a deformed bear, that the stress and fear made me see things that weren't there. But then I remember Elias's face, his white hair, and those words. Break the mountain. It's the only way to get rid of them. Them, not it. I've heard rumors over the years, more cattle killings in the Escadilla range, hikers gone missing. I keep expecting someone to hunt it down, to prove it was just an animal after all, but no one ever has. And sometimes, when I wake up from those nightmares, sweating and shaking, I wonder if what I encountered wasn't just one of them. I wonder how many more are hiding in those mountains, waiting, and I wonder what Elias meant. Break the mountain. It's the only way to get rid of them. Story 5. I've never really talked about this before, not properly anyway. It's been over 60 years now, but I still wake up in cold sweat some nights when I hear strange noises outside my window. What happened back in December of 1958 changed me forever. I was just 27 then, young and foolish, thinking I knew everything about the wilderness. My name's George Robson. I've been a hunter most of my life. Grew up tracking deer with my dad in the forests around Vancouver. By the time I was in my 20s, I was taking regular hunting trips up north with my buddy Bert Solgel. Bert was a few years older than me, served in the war, and knew his way around the backcountry better than anyone I'd ever met. That December, we decided to go on one last hunt before winter really set in. We headed up to the remote areas near Bella Coola, British Columbia. If you've never been there, it's some of the most pristine wilderness you'll find anywhere. Dense forests, steep mountains, and valleys so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. The kind of place where you could walk for days without seeing another human soul. We weren't alone on this trip. 2 other fellas joined us, Cal Peterson and Mike Danner. They were friends of Bert's from his logging days. Nice enough guys, but city slickers compared to us. They spent most of the time complaining about the cold or asking basic questions about tracking. We'd been out there for 3 days already, staying in this small hunting cabin that belonged to Bert's uncle. It was about 15 miles from the nearest road, tucked away in a valley surrounded by towering cedars and pines. The morning of that day, we'd tracked and shot a decent-sized buck. We'd spent the afternoon dressing it and hauling it back to camp, so by evening, we were all pretty tired but satisfied. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, passing a bottle of whiskey and swapping stories. The night was clear and cold, probably around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. There was a light dusting of snow on the ground from a flurry the previous day, just enough to cover the ground in patches, but not deep enough to make tracking difficult. I remember checking my watch around 8:30 in the evening. The fire was burning low, and Bert was in the middle of telling some tall tale about a grizzly he'd faced down years back. Cal and Mike were sitting across from us, facing the cabin, while Bert and I had our backs to it, looking out toward the tree line about 50 yards away. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Between the firelight and the darkness, shadows can do strange things. But then I focused, and my blood ran cold. Standing on what looked like a high tree stump about 50 yards from our camp was something big. I nudged Bert with my elbow, not wanting to speak and alert whatever was watching us. He stopped mid-sentence and followed my gaze. His face changed instantly. I'll never forget that look. His eyes went wide, and his mouth hung open slightly. He saw it too. The thing was massive. Standing upright on this stump, it must have been at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was dark, darker than the night around it, with a silhouette that was unmistakably not human, but not quite animal either. It had these long arms that hung down almost to where knees would be. The shoulders were broad and hunched slightly forward, and its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, no visible neck. The worst part was that even at that distance, in the dim light cast by our dying fire, I could tell it was watching us, intently, studying us. I couldn't make out its eyes exactly, but I felt its gaze lock with mine for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. "What are you looking at?" Cal asked from across the fire, noticing our silence. Before either of us could answer, the thing moved. It didn't just climb down or walk away. It practically vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, with a speed that nothing that size should have been capable of. There was a brief rustling in the underbrush, and then nothing but silence. "What the hell was that?" Bert whispered, his voice shaking slightly. I grabbed my rifle, which was leaning against the log beside me. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Bert grabbed his flashlight, and we both stood up. Cal and Mike looked confused, still oblivious to what we'd seen. "Stay here," I told them. "Keep the fire going." Bert and I made our way cautiously toward where the creature had been standing. The night was eerily quiet now. No owls, no distant calls of nocturnal animals, nothing. Just the soft crunch of our boots on patches of snow and frozen ground. When we reached the stump, I felt sick to my stomach. Up close, it was much taller than I'd initially thought, nearly 6 feet high. Whatever had been standing on it would have had to be enormous to appear the size it did from our campfire. "Look at this," Bert said, crouching down and shining his flashlight on the ground. There, in a patch of snow beside the stump, was a single footprint. Just one. It was huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. It wasn't like a bear track or anything else I'd ever seen in all my years hunting. It had 5 distinct toe impressions and a heel, almost human-like but massively oversized, and with a different weight distribution. "Where are the rest?" I asked, sweeping my flashlight in widening circles around the stump. That's when we realized something even more unsettling. The surrounding area was a patchwork of snow and bare ground. The creature had been deliberately stepping in spots without snow, leaving no tracks except for that single impression where it must have slipped or misjudged its footing. "It's hiding its trail," Bert said quietly. "It knows." We searched for about 15 minutes, pushing further into the tree line, but found nothing. No more footprints, no broken branches, no sign of where it had gone. Whatever this thing was, it knew how to move through the forest without leaving a trace, despite its size. "No human could have moved that fast," I said, as we reluctantly headed back to camp. Did you see how quickly it disappeared? 1 second it was there, the next. And no human is that big, Bert added. That wasn't a man, George. When we got back to the campfire, Cal and Mike bombarded us with questions. We told them what we'd seen, but I could tell they didn't fully believe us. Mike suggested it might have been a bear standing on its hind legs, but Bert and I knew better. We'd both seen plenty of bears in our time. This was something else entirely. Maybe it was curious about the fire, Bert suggested as we huddled closer to the flames. Maybe that's what drew it in. I nodded, remembering something my grandfather had told me years ago about strange creatures in the deep woods being attracted to human activity. At the time, I'd written it off as an old man's superstition. Now I wasn't so sure. We stayed up later than we should have, keeping the fire burning bright and taking turns watching the tree line. Part of me hoped the creature would return so I could get a better look at it, while another part dreaded exactly that. I'd brought my camera on this trip, but hadn't even thought to grab it when we went to investigate. Not that it would have mattered in the darkness. Around midnight, we decided to head into the cabin to get some sleep. None of us was particularly keen on being outside any longer than necessary. The cabin was small, just one room with 4 bunks, a wood stove, and a table. We stoked the stove, barred the door, and kept our rifles close. I don't think any of us expected to sleep much, but exhaustion eventually took over. I dozed off sometime after 1 in the morning, only to be jolted awake what felt like minutes later by the most horrifying sound I've ever heard. It was a scream, but not like any animal or human scream I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost like a moan, then rose to a pitch that seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. It was loud, so loud that it seemed like whatever made it must have been right outside our door. But the quality of it was what really turned my blood to ice. It wasn't just loud or high-pitched, it carried emotion, rage maybe, or frustration. Something intelligent was making that sound. All 4 of us were up instantly, grabbing for weapons and flashlights. The scream came again, longer this time, echoing through the valley. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the tree line where we'd seen the creature earlier. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, his face pale in the dim light of the cabin. None of us answered because none of us knew. We listened as the screams continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, as if whatever was making them was moving around the perimeter of our camp. This went on for about 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was almost worse than the screams. We waited, tense and ready, but nothing else happened. Eventually, dawn broke, and pale light filtered through the cabin's small windows. When we finally ventured outside, the world looked normal. Birds were singing, the morning was crisp and clear, and there was no sign that anything unusual had happened during the night. We searched the area around the cabin and found nothing, no tracks, no disturbances, nothing to indicate what had made those terrible sounds. We packed up and left that morning, cutting our hunting trip short by 2 days. None of us wanted to spend another night in that valley. The journey back to civilization was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Cal and Mike eventually convinced themselves that what they'd heard was just a mountain lion or some other predator, and that what Bert and I had seen was probably a bear. They needed a rational explanation, something that fit into their understanding of the world. I don't blame them, but Bert and I knew better. We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. That single footprint in the snow and those unearthly screams in the night were evidence of something beyond ordinary wildlife. I've been back to the Bella Coola area many times since then, though never to that exact spot. I've heard stories from locals and other hunters about strange sightings in those remote valleys. Tall, dark figures glimpsed between trees, unexplained footprints, and eerie nighttime calls. Most people dismiss these tales as campfire stories or misidentifications, but I know what I saw that December night in 1958. It wasn't a bear or a man or any known animal. It was something else, something watching us from the edge of the firelight with an intelligence that felt ancient and alien. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I get the feeling I'm being watched again. I'll turn quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever might be observing me. But there's never anything there, just shadows and trees and the quiet sounds of the forest. But I know it's out there. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see those eyes again, staring at me from the darkness, knowing and patient and wild. Story 6. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 60 years now. I'm 73 years old, and to this day, I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that summer evening in 1965. I was 7 years old then, living with my folks on our family ranch in East Texas, not far from the Sulphur River. Our family had raised cattle on that land for generations. My dad grew up there, and his dad before him. The place was in our blood. I loved that ranch, spending most of my childhood days exploring every inch of our property whenever I wasn't in school. That particular day started like any other summer day. I was excited about my new mini bike, a little Honda that my parents had gotten me for my birthday. I'd been riding it every chance I got, making up excuses to go anywhere, just so I could feel the wind in my hair. So when Dad mentioned he needed to check on the cattle that evening, I initially planned to stay home and ride my bike around the yard. "Jason," my dad called from the porch, "I need you to come with me to check on the herd." I remember feeling annoyed. "But Dad, I wanted to ride my bike. Can't I just stay here?" He gave me that look, the one that meant no arguing. "Not today, son. I need an extra set of hands." I reluctantly agreed, dragging my feet as I climbed into our old pickup truck. Dad had always been the quiet type, a man of few words who communicated more, through his actions than anything else, but he seemed particularly quiet that evening, almost tense. As we drove down the dusty country road leading to our pasture, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Our black and white border collie Rex was sitting between us, his head hanging out the window as usual. But as we approached the gate to our property, something changed. Rex's ears perked up, and he started making this weird sound, half whimper, half growl, something I'd never heard him do before. He pulled his head back inside and pressed against me, trembling slightly. Dad slowed the truck and looked at Rex with concern. Without saying a word, he reached behind the seat and pulled out his .30-06 rifle. I'd seen that gun hundreds of times. Dad used it for deer hunting every fall, but I'd never seen him check it so methodically, loading shells into it with careful precision before placing it between us on the seat. "Dad, what's wrong?" I asked, suddenly feeling uneasy. "Probably nothing," he replied, but his eyes told a different story. "Just being careful." We continued down the dirt road to where our cattle usually grazed. As we pulled up to the corral, I immediately noticed something wasn't right. Almost all of our Hereford cattle, normally spread across the pasture, were crowded inside the corral or pushing against the fence trying to get in. They were restless, moving around nervously, some making low, distressed sounds. Our bull, Bully, a massive Hereford that never showed fear of anything, was particularly agitated. He was pawing at the ground furiously, throwing dirt high into the air with his head lowered, snorting loudly. I'd never seen him act that way before. Dad turned off the engine but left the keys in the ignition. "Stay close to me," he said, reaching for his rifle, "and bring that box of shells." I grabbed the box from the glove compartment, my small hands shaking slightly. Rex refused to get out of the truck, instead crawling under the dashboard, whining. Rex was always the first one out, eager to help round up any stray cattle. Seeing him cower like that made my stomach tighten with fear. We had just stepped away from the truck when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams all these decades later. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. Part scream, part roar, it echoed across the pasture and seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, not a cougar or a bear or anything else I could identify. It was different, primal, almost human, but not quite. Dad froze, his knuckles white as he gripped the rifle. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the old wagon road that cut through the timber forest at the edge of our property. That's when I saw it. A massive figure stepped out from the tree line onto the field. Even from that distance, I could tell it was enormous. It crossed halfway to the old sawmill in just 4 strides, covering what must have been about 200 yards in seconds. Its movements were fluid but powerful, covering ground in a way that didn't seem possible. Then it stopped and just watched us. It stood there approximately 100 yards away, completely still. Even at that distance, I could make out its features. It was immense, much taller than my dad, who was 6'2". Its arms were disproportionately long, with hands that hung past its knees. Its body was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, except around its mouth and eyes. It wasn't muscular in the way humans are, but it looked stout and powerful. Not bulky, but tough, like it was made for the wilderness. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other across that field. And then, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, it simply turned and disappeared back into the forest, moving with that same impossible speed and grace. For several long moments, neither Dad nor I spoke. The only sounds were the nervous lowing of the cattle and Rex's continued whimpering from inside the truck. Finally, Dad lowered his rifle slightly and turned to me. His face was pale, his expression grave. "That's one of the wild men I told you about," he said quietly. In that moment, the stories my dad and grandmother had told me over the years suddenly became real. They had both mentioned wild men that inhabited the forests and swamps along the Sulphur River. As a kid, I'd dismissed these tales as just that. Stories meant to keep me from wandering too far into the woods alone. Ghost stories, like the ones we told around campfires. But this was no ghost. This was flesh and blood, standing right there in our field. "What? What is it?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad shook his head slowly. "Don't rightly know, son. My daddy saw them, his daddy before him too. Been around these parts as long as our family has." We didn't stay to feed the cattle that evening. Dad quickly checked that the corral gate was secure, then ushered me back to the truck. The entire drive home, he kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on his rifle. When we got home, Mom immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, alarmed by our early return and Dad's grim expression. "One of the wild men was at the pasture," Dad said simply. Mom's face went pale. She didn't ask for details, didn't question what Dad had seen. She just nodded and pulled me close, as if making sure I was still in one piece. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in our field, watching us. I kept hearing that terrible scream roar echoing through the darkness. Around midnight, I crept downstairs and found my parents still awake at the kitchen table, talking in hushed tones. "Shouldn't be going out there alone anymore," Mom was saying. "He hasn't bothered us before," Dad replied, "all these years. But what if—" They stopped when they noticed me standing in the doorway. "Can't sleep, Jason?" Mom asked, trying to sound normal. I shook my head. Is it going to come to our house?" Dad got up and knelt in front of me. "No, son. They stay in the deep woods, near the river. They don't come to houses." "But how do you know?" He hesitated before answering. "Because they've been there all my life, and they've never come to ours." That night, Dad let me sleep in their room, on a pallet beside their bed. It was the only way I could close my eyes without seeing that creature. The next morning, the experience felt almost like a dream, something too strange to be real. But when Dad mentioned he was going back to check on the cattle and that he was taking his rifle again, I knew it had been real. What hit me hardest in the days that followed was the realization of how vulnerable I had been all those times I'd gone to that pasture alone. I'd been tasked with feeding the cattle several times a week, riding my bike down that same road, exploring the old wagon trail, climbing the sawdust pile by the abandoned sawmill, working the fence line, all in the territory of these beings that my family had apparently encountered for generations. How many times had they watched me? How many times had I been completely unaware of their presence as I played carelessly in their domain? Dad and I never saw the wild man again, at least not that clearly. But there were other signs over the years. Strange sounds in the distance, cattle acting nervous for no apparent reason, enormous footprints near the river after heavy rains. Once, when I was 12, I found a deer carcass hanging in a tree, nearly 15 feet off the ground. Dad just looked at it, nodded and said we should head home. I've researched this phenomenon as an adult. I've read about similar sightings across East Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, all through the piney woods and swamplands. Some people call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others have different names. My family just called them the wild men. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Most days I barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw that summer evening in 1965. And sometimes, when I'm driving along a country road at dusk or walking near a dense tree line, I still feel like I'm being watched by something just beyond my sight. Something that's been there longer than my family, longer than any of us, watching and waiting in the shadowy forests along the Sulphur River. Story 7. I've sat on this experience for almost 20 years now. Never really told anyone except my son Eric about what happened that day. And even that was only a few years back. I guess I've always been afraid people would think I'm crazy or making things up for attention. But after Eric encouraged me to share this, and after reading other people's similar accounts here, I think I'm finally ready to talk about it. This happened back in the spring of 2003. I've always been interested in Native American artifacts, particularly arrowheads and pottery fragments. It's been a hobby of mine since I was a kid, when my grandfather would take me out to creek beds and show me how to spot them. As an adult, I've continued the tradition, and I've built up a modest collection over the years. That day, I decided to check out an area near Ludesville Campground in White County, Georgia. There was a clear-cut section near Horse Range Mountain that I'd heard might be promising for artifacts. The logging activity sometimes exposes things that have been buried for centuries. I packed some water, a few sandwiches, my digging tools, and headed out early in my old Ford Bronco. It was a beautiful day. Clear blue skies, temperature in the mid-60s. Perfect weather for being outdoors. I spent most of the morning and early afternoon searching the clear-cut area, finding a couple of broken points and what might have been part of a grinding stone. Nothing spectacular, but enough to make the trip worthwhile. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to call it a day and head back home. The sun was still up, but I knew it would start getting dark in a few hours, and I didn't want to be navigating those Forestry Service roads after sunset. They're not well maintained, full of potholes, and there's no lighting out there. I packed up my gear, got back in my Bronco, and started driving down this winding US Forestry Service road. I had the windows down, enjoying the spring air and the smell of the pines. The road curved through the trees, occasionally opening up to give views of the surrounding mountains. It was peaceful, just the sound of my tires on the gravel and birds in the distance. I'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when I noticed something moving ahead of me, probably about 200 yards up the road. My first thought was bear. We get black bears in these parts, and spring is when they become active again after winter. I slowed down, then stopped completely. I've always been cautious around wildlife, especially the larger predators. A bear can do serious damage to a person, and I wasn't interested in getting too close. From that distance, it looked like a bear, dark in color and bulky, but something felt off. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The sun was behind me, so I had good visibility, but the creature was partially obscured by the trees along the road. That's when I noticed how it was moving. Bears will sometimes stand on their hind legs, but they don't walk that way for any distance. This thing was walking fully upright, not just for a few steps, but continuously. It had a consistent bipedal gait, like a human, but with a slight forward stoop. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. This was no bear. I sat completely still in my Bronco, engine idling, watching this thing move. It was walking downhill toward a creek that ran perpendicular to the road, moving with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I watched it travel about 75 yards before it reached the creek area, which was surrounded by thick vegetation, rhododendrons and mountain laurel that grow dense in these parts. My heart was pounding in my chest. I've been in these woods my whole life. I know what bears look like, what deer look like, what every animal native to North Georgia looks like. This wasn't anything I recognized. The way it moved was just wrong. Too fluid for a bear on its hind legs, but not quite human either. I expected to see it emerge on the other side of the creek bed. The vegetation was thick, but there was a clear area beyond it where I should have been able to spot anything that size moving through. I slowly drove forward to where the road crossed the creek, thinking I might get a better view from there. I stopped at the small bridge and turned off my engine. The silence was immediate and complete. No sounds of splashing in the creek, no snapping twigs or rustling leaves, nothing to indicate where this thing had gone. I rolled down both windows and just listened, scanning the area where I thought it should have emerged. Minutes passed, 5, then 10. Nothing moved. It was like it had vanished into thin air. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, just silence. I felt a deep unease settle over me. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't normal wildlife. And the silence, it felt wrong, like everything in the forest was holding its breath. Part of me was curious. I wanted to get out of my Bronco and investigate, maybe look for tracks along the creek bank. But a stronger part of me, some primal instinct, was screaming at me to leave, to get back on the road and drive away as fast as possible. I sat there, debating with myself, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I've never been one to scare easily. I've encountered bears, wild boars, even a mountain lion once. And while I've always been cautious, I've never felt this kind of fear before. It was visceral, almost paralyzing. In the end, the fear won out. I started my Bronco and pulled away from the creek, driving faster than was probably safe on that rough road. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but the road behind me remained empty. When I got home that evening, my wife asked me if I'd found anything interesting. I showed her the few artifacts I'd collected and said nothing about what I'd seen. I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. What would I even say? I saw something in the woods that looked like a man but moved like no man I've ever seen. She'd think I was losing my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear and the distance and lighting had played tricks on my eyes. Maybe it was a hiker in dark clothing. But I knew deep down that neither of those explanations fit what I'd witnessed. The next day, I almost drove back out there. I thought about bringing my camera, looking for tracks, trying to find some evidence of what I'd seen. But that feeling of dread was still with me, and I couldn't make myself go back. Over the next few weeks, I found myself researching unexplained sightings in the North Georgia mountains. I discovered I wasn't the only one who'd seen something strange in those woods. There were other accounts, hikers, campers, locals, who described seeing large, upright figures that didn't move quite like humans. Some called them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others just called them the mountain people. I've never been one for cryptozoology or paranormal stuff. I've always considered myself pretty grounded in reality. But what I saw that day didn't fit. into my understanding of reality, and it shook me. For years, I kept the encounter to myself. I avoided that area of the forest, and I stopped going artifact hunting alone. Whenever friends or family wanted to go camping near Ludesville or Horse Range Mountain, I always found an excuse not to go. It wasn't until my son Eric was in his 20s that I finally told someone. We were sitting around a campfire in my backyard, far from any deep woods, having a few beers, when he asked me if I'd ever seen anything strange in all my years of exploring the mountains. Something in his tone made me think he might have had his own experience, so I took a deep breath and told him everything. I expected disbelief, maybe even mockery, but Eric listened intently. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time before saying, "I believe you, Dad. There are things in those mountains that don't make sense." He encouraged me to share my story more widely, said there were communities online where people discussed these kinds of encounters without judgment. I've been reading those accounts for a while now, and many of them sound eerily similar to what I experienced. I still don't know what I saw that day. I can't explain how something that large could disappear so completely without making a sound. I can't explain the unnatural silence that fell over the forest, or the fear that gripped me so strongly. All I know is that there's something out there in the woods of White County that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of the natural world. Something that moves like a man, but isn't a man. Something that knows those mountains better than any human could. I haven't been back to that specific area since that day. I still go artifact hunting occasionally, but always in open areas, always with a partner, and always home before the sun starts to set. Some things you only need to experience once to know you never want to experience them again. To this day, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, the image of that dark figure moving through the trees still vivid in my mind nearly 2 decades later. Whatever it was, it changed me, made me realize that maybe we don't know these mountains as well as we think we do, and maybe that's for the best. Story 8. I've spent my whole life in Montana, born and raised. I'm used to the wilderness, the isolation, the wildlife. I've hunted elk since I was 14, camped in places where you don't see another soul for days, and I've never been afraid of being alone in the woods. Until last year. It was the summer of 2009, right in the middle of that damn mortgage crisis when everything went to hell. I'm a painter by trade, not the artsy kind, the kind that paints houses. Business had dried up almost completely with the housing market crash. My wife had just given birth to our first kid, a little boy, and I was desperate for work. When I got a call about renovating a house out in the Bull Mountains, I jumped at the opportunity, even though it was a good 2-hour drive from home. The contractor, Dave, was renovating this big house that had been foreclosed on. The bank wanted it fixed up to sell. It was way out there, surrounded by miles of forest and mountain terrain. We agreed I'd sleep on site during the week to avoid the commute. I'd work from dawn till dusk, then crash there and head home on weekends to see my family. The pay was good, and we needed the money. The first day went fine. I spent hours scraping old paint, prepping walls, the usual stuff. Dave left around 5, and I kept working until about 10 that night. I was trying to get ahead so I could finish the job faster. When I finally stopped, I was exhausted. I had a small air mattress in the back of my 2001 Dodge 4x4, which I'd parked about 20 yards from the house. I climbed in, locked the doors, and tried to sleep. That's when I first felt it, this weird sensation of being watched. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's not right. I sat up and peered out the windows, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking maybe it was a mountain lion or a bear, but something told me it wasn't. Whatever was out there felt deliberate, focused. I barely slept that night, drifting in and out of consciousness while clutching my hunting knife. The second day I was tired, but pushed through the work. Dave came by to check my progress around noon, then left again. As evening approached, I started dreading another night in the truck. After I finished working, I took some black trash bags I had for collecting debris and taped them over the windows of my truck from the inside. I know it sounds weird, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was staring at me and I wanted some privacy. I managed to fall asleep around 11, but woke up sometime in the middle of the night to my truck rocking back and forth. It wasn't subtle. The whole vehicle was shaking like something was pushing against it. My first thought was that the wind had picked up. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside to take a leak. That's when I realized there was no wind. None. The night was dead silent. No rustling leaves, no distant owl hoots, nothing. Just complete, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong. I hurried back into my truck, locked the doors, and sat there wide awake until dawn, straining my ears for any sound. Nothing came. By the third day, I was exhausted. The work was suffering because I couldn't focus. I was jumpy, irritable, and sleep-deprived. Dave noticed and asked if everything was okay. I just told him I wasn't sleeping well in my truck. I didn't mention the watching or the rocking. It sounded crazy even to me. He suggested I could sleep in the house if I wanted to. The house wasn't finished. No doorknobs on most doors, some windows still needing to be installed, but it seemed better than the truck. That night, I set up my sleeping bag in what would be the living room. I had my pistol, a Glock 19 I always carry when I'm in remote areas, and my knife next to me. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just normal wood stuff getting to me because I was tired. But that night was worse. The feeling of being watched was so intense, I could almost feel eyes boring into me from every direction. Every creak of the unfinished house made me jolt. I kept my flashlight on until the batteries started to dim, then lay in the dark, wide awake, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. Then nothing. I gripped my pistol so tight my hand cramped. Nothing came inside, but I didn't sleep a wink. The 4th day, I was a mess. My hands were shaking as I tried to paint. Dave came by and immediately noticed something was wrong. I finally admitted I wasn't sleeping well and was considering driving back home each night despite the distance. That's when he mentioned he had an old RV parked down the hill that I could use. It had a bed, a bathroom, and a lock on the door. I almost hugged him. I was so relieved. That evening, after Dave left, I finished up around 8 and was standing by my truck having a cigarette before heading down to the RV. The sun had set, and it was that deep blue twilight that comes before true darkness. I was just standing there, exhausted, when I heard it. A clicking sound, gentle, rhythmic, like someone taking 2 pieces of wood and tapping them together. Click, click, click. It was coming from about 30 yards downhill, in the darkness beyond where I could see. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the evening it carried clearly. I froze, cigarette halfway to my mouth. The clicking continued, steady and intentional. It wasn't random or natural. It had a pattern, a rhythm that felt calculated. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know what deer sound like when they move, what bears do, what mountain lions do. This wasn't any of that. I stood there for what felt like forever, just listening. The clicking continued, never changing pace. Something about it made the hair on my arms stand up. It felt like communication, like something was sending a message. I don't know what possessed me, but I reached into my truck and grabbed my elk call. It's a tube-shaped thing hunters use to mimic cow elk calls. I've called in bulls from hundreds of yards away with it. I put it to my lips and made a few soft cow calls. The clicking stopped instantly. There was a moment of complete silence, and then, Jesus, I still get chills thinking about it. I heard something drop, whatever was making the clicking sound, and start moving. Fast. It wasn't lumbering like a bear or bounding like a deer. It was running, bipedal, 2 legs. It sprinted about 50 yards to my left, jumped a fence. I heard the distinct sound of the wire being hit and springing back, crossed the dirt road, and then started climbing the rim rock behind me. The speed was impossible. In seconds, it had covered ground that would take me minutes to navigate, and it did it in near darkness. I could hear it moving up the steep rock face behind the house, scrambling up what was practically a cliff with the agility of something that didn't obey normal laws of physics. And then it screamed. I've heard elk bugle, coyotes howl, mountain lions shriek. This was nothing like that. It started deep, almost bass-like, and then climbed to a pitch so high it was like a hawk's call, but 100 times louder. The sound echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the rim rocks surrounding me. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world. I ran. I didn't think, didn't grab anything from my truck except my keys, my pistol, and a flashlight. I sprinted down the hill toward the RV, fumbled with the door, and locked myself inside. I sat there with my gun in my lap until morning, listening, waiting. Nothing came for me that night, but the watching didn't stop. I finished the job. I had to. We needed the money. Every evening when Dave left, I'd work until there was still enough light to make it safely to the RV. Every night, I'd make that walk with my pistol in one hand, knife in the other, and flashlight in my mouth, moving as fast as I could without running. And every night I felt it watching me from somewhere in the darkness. I never saw it, not once, but I know it was there. I know it watched me every day, waiting. Sometimes at night I'd hear the clicking again, always from a different direction. Sometimes far away, sometimes terrifyingly close to the RV. Once, something walked around the entire RV, its footsteps clear in the silence, but I couldn't bring myself to look out the windows. The last day I was there, as I was packing up my supplies, I found something placed on the hood of my truck. A small pile of pebbles arranged in a perfect circle. In the center was a small bone. I don't know from what animal, and I didn't touch it to find out. I've been painting houses for 15 years. I've worked in remote locations plenty of times, but I'll never go back to the Bull Mountains. Whatever was out there wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't anything I've encountered before. And it knew I was there. It wanted me to know it was watching. Sometimes now, when I'm working late and the sun starts to set, I catch myself listening for that clicking sound, and when I'm lying in bed at night, sometimes I swear I can feel something watching me through the window, even though I'm miles away from those mountains. Story 9. I've been hesitating to share this for a long time, 24 years to be exact. Most people would think I'm crazy or making this up for attention. I'm not. What my son Tyler and I saw that evening in September of 1999 has haunted me ever since. And I finally need to get this off my chest. I'm a construction worker by trade. Back then, I was 34, divorced, and had my 7-year-old son Tyler with me for the weekend. I was working on a cabin excavation job in the Monte Cristo region of Utah. It was beautiful country, dense forests, rolling hills, the kind of wilderness that makes you feel small. The job was going to take about 2 weeks, so I figured I'd bring Tyler along. He loved camping, and I thought it would be good father-son time. We'd been at the site for 5 days already. The days were getting shorter as September rolled on, but the weather was still decent. That particular day had been productive. We'd made good progress on the foundation work. Tyler had been entertaining himself around camp, collecting rocks and building little forts with sticks. He was a good kid, never complained about being bored or wanting to go home. Around 6 in the evening, with about an hour of daylight left, I decided we deserved a break. I had my ATV with me, nothing fancy, just a reliable Yamaha that could handle the rugged terrain. Tyler's face lit up when I suggested we go for a ride. He grabbed his jacket and helmet faster than I could get mine. "Can we go to that ridge we saw yesterday, Dad?" he asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "Sure thing, buddy," I replied. "But we'll need to be quick. Don't want to be out after dark." Tyler climbed on behind me, wrapping his small arms around my waist. I could feel him bouncing with excitement as we set off. The engine roared to life, and we headed out from our campsite, following a dirt trail that wound through the trees. The Monte Cristo region is beautiful but isolated. Miles of forest, rocky outcroppings, old fence lines from ranches long abandoned. That evening, the setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, and there was a slight chill in the air, the kind of perfect September evening that makes you glad to be alive. We rode for about 20 minutes, climbing higher into the hills. Tyler pointed out interesting rocks or the occasional deer we spotted, just normal stuff. We reached the ridge he wanted to see, stopped for a few minutes to take in the view of the valley below, then turned around to head back to camp. The sun was getting low, painting the sky in oranges and reds. I figured we had maybe 30 minutes of decent light left. About halfway back to camp, we were moving along an old dirt trail that ran parallel to an ancient fence line, just rotting posts with a few strands of rusted wire still clinging to them. The forest was thicker on our right side, pines and aspens crowding together. To our left was more open terrain with scattered trees and brush. I wasn't going particularly fast, maybe 15 miles per hour, since the trail was bumpy. Tyler was quiet behind me, probably tired from the excitement of the day. Then I felt it, his small hands suddenly tightening around my waist, his little fingers digging into my jacket. At first I thought he was just getting cold or maybe scared because it was getting dark. Then he started tapping my shoulder urgently. I slowed down a bit and turned my head to ask what was wrong. "Dad! Dad! Go faster!" His voice was high-pitched, scared in a way I'd never heard before. "What's wrong, Ty?" I asked, still not stopping. "There's something over there, by the trees. It's big, Dad." Kids see things all the time. Deer, elk, maybe even a bear. Nothing to panic about, but the fear in his voice made me look. I turned my head to the right, toward the tree line along the old fence. That's when I saw it. About 50 meters away, walking parallel to our path, was something I still struggle to describe accurately. It was massive. I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over what my height would have been standing next to it. 8 feet tall at least. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair or fur, a deep brown, almost black in the fading light. But it wasn't just the size that struck me. It was how it moved. This wasn't some guy in a costume. The stride was efficient, smooth, powerful. Its arms were long, swinging slightly as it walked. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too big, too broad, but not bulky like a bear. The head sat directly on the shoulders, no real neck to speak of, and it was slightly hunched forward. For about 5 seconds, I just stared, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I'd slowed the ATV almost to a stop without realizing it. The thing, and I know how this sounds, the Bigfoot was walking calmly, deliberately, as if it had somewhere to be. It didn't look at us directly, but I got the distinct impression it knew exactly where we were. Then Tyler's frightened voice snapped me back to reality. "Dad, go!" I twisted the throttle hard, and the ATV lurched forward. As we accelerated, the creature turned its head toward us. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance in the fading light, but I saw its head rotate smoothly to track our movement. Then, with no urgency at all, it turned and stepped into the forest, disappearing among the trees. I drove like hell back to camp. Tyler was pressed against my back, his helmet occasionally bumping against mine as we hit bumps in the trail. Neither of us spoke. What could we possibly say? The ride back took maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When we got back to camp, I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment. Tyler climbed off first, taking his helmet off with shaking hands. "Dad," he said, his voice small and uncertain. "What was that?" I remember struggling with how to answer. I'd always been the practical type. I didn't believe in monsters or myths. Bigfoot was for tabloids and conspiracy theorists, not for reasonable people like me. But what we'd just seen, there was no reasonable explanation. "I don't know for sure, Ty," I finally answered, trying to keep my voice steady for his sake. "Probably just a bear walking funny in the bad light." But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for that long. They don't have that silhouette. They don't move that way. Tyler wasn't buying it either. That wasn't a bear, Dad. It was walking like a person, but huge. I busied myself with building up our campfire, trying to create some normalcy. Tyler sat close to me, not taking his eyes off the surrounding forest, now growing darker by the minute. He didn't want to go into the tent when bedtime came. I didn't blame him. "Can we sleep in the truck tonight?" he asked, his voice wavering. "Sure, buddy," I agreed quickly. I wasn't too keen on sleeping in the tent either. We moved our sleeping bags to my work truck. I locked the doors, something I'd never bothered to do at a remote work site before. Tyler eventually fell asleep, exhausted from the fear and excitement, but I stayed awake most of the night. I kept replaying what we'd seen in my mind. The smooth gait, the casual way it disappeared into the trees, the absolute wrongness of seeing something that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught to believe. During those long, dark hours, I found myself grabbing my work notebook and sketching what I'd seen while it was fresh in my mind. The broad shoulders, the lack of a neck, the proportions of the limbs. I'm no artist, but I needed to document it somehow, to convince myself I wasn't crazy. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start around 4 in the morning. The forest was dead quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just silence. And I had this overwhelming sensation of being watched. I peered out the truck windows, but could see nothing in the darkness beyond our campsite. Still, the feeling persisted. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a tightness in my chest. I checked on Tyler, still sleeping soundly, and decided then and there that we were leaving as soon as it was light enough. As dawn broke, I woke Tyler and started packing up our gear. He didn't ask why we were leaving early. He seemed relieved. We worked quickly, throwing things into the truck without much organization. By 7, we were ready to go. Before we left, I took one last look around the campsite. The forest looked normal in the morning light, just trees and rocks and dirt. But about 30 yards from our camp, at the edge of the clearing, something caught my eye. I walked over, telling Tyler to stay by the truck. There, in the soft earth, was a footprint. Not a boot print or an animal track I recognized. It was huge, easily twice the size of my work boot, and deeply pressed into the ground. It had toes, 5 of them, spread wide. I stared at it, feeling that same sense of wrongness wash over me. I took a picture with my old film camera, but later the photo didn't show the details clearly enough. I didn't tell Tyler about the footprint. We got in the truck and drove out of there, back to Ogden, cutting the job short. I called my boss from a payphone and made up some excuse about Tyler being sick. He wasn't happy, but I didn't care. There was no way I was going back to that site. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I showed my sketch to a couple of hunting buddies, careful not to mention exactly what I thought it was. To my surprise, one of them nodded knowingly. "You saw something up in Monte Cristo, didn't you?" he asked quietly. When I cautiously admitted we had, he told me there had been similar sightings in that region for years. Most people kept quiet about it because they didn't want the ridicule. But among the hunters and loggers who spent time in those remote areas, the stories persisted. That was 24 years ago. Tyler's grown now, with kids of his own. We don't talk about that day much, but sometimes when we're alone, he'll ask me if I still remember. Of course I do. How could I forget? I've never gone back to Monte Cristo. My construction work has taken me to other remote areas over the years, but I'm different now. More cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I don't dismiss strange stories the way I used to. Sometimes I think about reporting what we saw to one of those Bigfoot research groups, but what's the point? I have no proof beyond my memory and a child's frightened testimony, but I know what we saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist but does. I still have that sketch I drew that night, tucked away in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, remembering the fluid way that creature moved, the casual confidence of something that had no fear of being seen. Those moments have stayed with me, crystal clear while other memories have faded. I'm not asking anyone to believe me, but if you're ever in the Monte Cristo region of Utah and you get that feeling of being watched, don't ignore it. You might not be alone out there. Story 10. I still don't know what to make of what happened to me last summer in Kananaskis. I've spent months trying to rationalize it, but I can't shake the feeling that something was hunting me that night. I need to get this off my chest. I'm a hobby photographer, nothing professional, just a guy who loves capturing landscapes, especially mountain sunsets. I live about an hour from Kananaskis country in Alberta, and I've been going there for years without incident. June 19th, 2018 changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening, and I decided to head out after work to catch the sunset behind Mount Kidd. The forecast was perfect, clear skies with just enough clouds to make the sunset pop. I'd done this route dozens of times before, so I knew exactly where to set up. There's this little pullout along Highway 66 where you can get a perfect view of the valley. I arrived around 8:30, parked my Honda, and decided to wait in the car for a bit since the best light wouldn't happen until 9:15 or so. The pullout was empty, not unusual for a weekday evening. I rolled down my windows to enjoy the mountain air and scrolled through some photos on my camera from the weekend. That's when I heard it. The first knock. It was distant but distinct, like someone had struck a baseball bat against a tree trunk. A single, solid thok that echoed slightly. I looked up from my camera, thinking maybe there were hikers or campers nearby, but I couldn't see anyone. The sound had come from deep in the forest to the south of the highway. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just someone setting up camp, I figured. But then I heard it again, about 30 seconds later. Same sound, same direction, maybe 2 kilometers away. I got out of my car and listened more carefully. The evening was otherwise peaceful, birds chirping, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I popped my trunk and grabbed my tripod, figuring I should start setting up anyway. That's when I spotted the baseball bat in my trunk. I keep it there for, well, I don't know, peace of mind, I guess. And something made me curious. I grabbed the bat, walked over to a nearby tree, and gave it a solid whack. Thok. I waited, not really expecting anything. But about 15 seconds later, there it was. Another knock from the forest, noticeably closer this time. A chill ran down my spine. Just coincidence, I told myself. But I couldn't help myself. I knocked again. Thok. And sure enough, the response came. Closer still. I don't know what possessed me to continue, but for the next 15 minutes I kept knocking, and whatever was out there kept answering. Each response seemed to come from about 100 meters, closer than the last. At first it was almost exciting, like I was communicating with something, but as the sun began to set and the thing kept getting closer, excitement turned to unease. By 9:45, the sun was below the horizon, and the forest was getting dark fast. I checked my watch. The knocking had been going on for almost an hour, and whatever was making the sound was now maybe 500 meters away. Close enough that I started scanning the tree line, expecting to see something, a person, an animal, but there was nothing visible. I decided to do one more knock, a hard one. I wound up and struck the tree with all my strength. Thok! What came next still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. From the south side of the highway, maybe 300 meters away, came a howl that froze me in place. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. I've heard those plenty of times. This was deeper, more powerful, almost human-like in its modulation, but no human could make that sound. It started low and rose to a pitch that made my ears hurt, lasting for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. Before the echo of the howl had even faded, there was another wood knock, but this one came from the north side of the highway, maybe 300 meters in the opposite direction. The realization hit me like ice water. There were at least two of them, and they had me between them. Then everything went silent, and I mean everything. The birds stopped chirping. The insects stopped buzzing. Even the wind seemed to die. It was like someone had pressed mute on the entire forest. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when nature goes quiet, something is wrong. I stood by my car, bat still in hand, straining to hear anything. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears, I worried it might give away my position. The silence stretched for maybe 2 minutes, which felt like an eternity. Then I heard it, a branch snapping to the south, much closer than the last knock, maybe 200 meters away now. I spun toward the sound, but could see nothing in the growing darkness. The forest was just a wall of black shadows. Another snap, this time from the north. Also closer. They were closing in on both sides. I threw the bat in my trunk, grabbed my tripod and camera, and practically dove into my driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped my keys twice before getting them in the ignition. The whole time, I kept my eyes on the forest edges on both sides of the highway. As I finally got the engine started, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the light's reach. Something tall moving between the trees, but it was gone so fast I can't be sure it wasn't just shadows playing tricks. I didn't wait to find out. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, tires screeching on the pavement. I must have been doing 100 kilometers an hour down that dark mountain highway, taking curves way too fast, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, where there were other cars and streetlights. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors all the way home. When I finally got back to my apartment, I locked the door, then checked it twice. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. What had I been talking to out there? How did they know to respond to my knocks? Why did they seem to be coordinating, approaching from different directions? The thing that keeps eating at me is the intelligence behind it all. These weren't just random animal sounds. Whatever was out there understood the concept of communication. They recognized my knocks as signals and responded in kind. They positioned themselves strategically. They worked together. I've researched everything I can find about Kananaskis wildlife. Nothing explains what I experienced. I've thought about reporting it, but who would I even tell? What would I say? I played knock-knock with something scary in the forest. I'd sound insane. I went back to that pullout 2 weeks later in broad daylight with a friend. I told him I wanted to scout photo locations, but really, I needed to see if there was any evidence of something. We walked around for an hour and found nothing unusual. No strange tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anything had been there. But as we were leaving, my friend pointed to a tree about 50 meters from where I'd parked that night. Weird marking, he said. There was a strip of bark missing at about 7 feet up the trunk, way higher than a deer or elk could reach. It looked fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored. I haven't been back to Kananaskis since then, not alone anyway. I've given up sunset photography. I stick to crowded areas and daylight hours now. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed that night. Would I have finally seen what was making those sounds? Or would I have become one of those mysterious disappearances in national parks you read about? All I know is that something intelligent was in those woods, something that understood what I was doing, something that coordinated with others of its kind, something that was closing in on me from multiple directions. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still hear that howl, that impossible bone-chilling howl that was neither human nor animal. And I wonder if whatever made it is still out there in the mountains, waiting for someone else to knock. Story 11. I've been debating whether to post this for a long time. It happened 3 summers ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've told a few people, but most just laugh or give me that look like I've lost my mind. Figured I might get a better reception here from folks who've had similar experiences. I was 22, working a seasonal job with the Grays Harbor County Parks Department to make some money between college semesters. Not a glamorous gig by any means. Mowing grass, emptying trash cans, cleaning bathrooms, the usual maintenance stuff. The pay was decent though, and I liked being outdoors instead of stuck in some office. My supervisor would text me a list of parks to hit each day, and I'd drive around in this beat-up white Ford pickup with county parks stenciled on the doors. Most of the parks were pretty standard: playgrounds, picnic areas, baseball fields, but there were a few remote ones that barely got any visitors, especially during weekdays. Riverdale Park was one of those places. It's this small, out-of-the-way spot along the river, maybe 15 minutes outside town. No playground equipment, just a couple picnic tables, a small parking area, and a path down to the water. The kind of place locals go fishing or to drink beers away from cops. It wasn't on my regular rotation. Maybe once every week or two, I'd have to go out there. That morning started like any other. It was early June, and I remember checking my phone when my alarm went off. 5:15 in the morning. Way too early, but that was the job. We'd start at 6 to get the parks cleaned up before people arrived. The weather was typical Pacific Northwest. Foggy, damp, probably mid-50s. I threw on a hoodie, jeans and my work boots, grabbed a granola bar and headed out. I remember the drive to Riverdale clearly. The fog was thick that morning, hanging low over the fields. My headlights barely cut through it, and there wasn't another car on the road. The radio was playing some morning talk show, but I wasn't really listening. I was still half asleep, sipping gas station coffee that tasted like warm dishwater. I pulled into Riverdale around 6:15. The park was dead silent, except for the sound of the river. The fog was even thicker near the water, swirling around the pickup's headlights. I parked near the bathroom building and just sat there for a minute, finishing my coffee and dreading having to clean the bathroom. Those remote park bathrooms were always the worst. Spiders everywhere, and sometimes evidence of parties from the night before. The work itself was routine. I cleaned the bathroom, thankfully not too disgusting that day, emptied the 2 trash cans, and used a weed whacker around the picnic tables. The whole time I had this weird feeling of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but didn't see anything besides trees and fog. I chalked it up to just being alone in a creepy, isolated place at dawn. By 7:30, I was done and loading the equipment back into the truck. I was actually ahead of schedule and thinking about stopping for a proper breakfast before hitting the next park on my list. That's when it happened. I was driving out along the gravel access road that connects to the main highway. The road winds through a wooded area for about a quarter mile before reaching the main road. I was maybe halfway down this access road, going slow because of the fog and the potholes, when my headlights caught something on the right side of the road. At first I thought it was a bear. We get black bears around here sometimes, not common but not unheard of either. But as I got closer, I realized whatever this was, it was standing upright. And it was big, really big. I instinctively hit the brakes. The truck skidded slightly on the gravel, and I came to a stop maybe 30 yards from this thing. The engine was still running, headlights pointed right at it, but the fog made everything hazy. What I could see clearly was a massive figure, easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was broad, not fat, but thick and powerful looking, and it was covered in dark hair or fur, a deep brown color, almost black in the poor light. I'm a hunter, have been since I was 14. I know every animal native to this region, their shapes, movements, behaviors. This wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't an elk or any other large animal I'd ever encountered. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down to around its knees, much longer than a human's. The shoulders were massive, maybe twice as wide as mine. For about 10 seconds, we just stayed like that, me frozen in the truck, this thing standing motionless at the edge of the road. Then it turned its head toward me. That's when my blood went cold. I couldn't make out facial features clearly through the fog, but I could feel it looking right at me, not like an animal's curious glance. This was deliberate, intelligent. What happened next is burned into my memory. This thing, and I still don't know what to call it, suddenly moved. It didn't lumber or shamble like a bear. It didn't even run like any animal I've seen. It literally bolted across the road in 2 or 3 strides and disappeared into the trees toward the river. The speed was impossible for something that size. Fluid, powerful movement, covering ground faster than an Olympic sprinter. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. I sat in that truck, white-knuckling the steering wheel, for what felt like forever. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't move. I was trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to fit it into some category my brain could understand. But I couldn't. A rational part of my mind was saying it must have been a bear, or maybe a guy in a costume. Though who would be out in the woods at dawn in a costume? But I know what I saw. The height, the proportions, the way it moved. None of it matches anything normal. After maybe 5 minutes of sitting there, I finally got my shit together enough to drive. I didn't floor it or anything dramatic. I was too shocked for that. I just drove slowly, mechanically, out to the main road and back toward town. I remember checking my rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see that thing following me. I didn't tell anyone at work. What would I say? "Hey boss, I think I saw Bigfoot at Riverdale this morning." Instead, I just went through the motions at the next couple parks, my mind replaying those 10 seconds over and over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, the way it moved with impossible speed. I went online and started researching local wildlife, trying to convince myself it was something explainable, but nothing fit. Then I made the mistake of looking up Bigfoot sightings in Grays Harbor County. I'd always thought those stories were bullshit. Drunk hunters seeing shadows, tourists mistaking bears for monsters. But as I read account after account, chills ran down my spine. Some of the descriptions matched what I saw with eerie accuracy. The height, the broad shoulders, the long arms, the incredible speed. A week later, Riverdale came up on my rotation again. I almost called in sick, but curiosity got the better of me. This time I arrived later, around 8, when the sun was fully up and the fog had mostly burned off. After finishing my maintenance tasks quickly, I went to the spot where I'd seen the figure. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe. Hair caught on a branch. Some Hollywood-style evidence. There was nothing. The ground was too hard and rocky for prints, and I couldn't see any broken branches or disturbed vegetation. Whatever had been there a week earlier had left no trace. I ventured a little way into the woods in the direction it had gone, toward the river. The underbrush got thick pretty fast, and I'm not ashamed to admit I was too freaked out to go very far alone. Every snapping twig made me jump. I gave up after about 15 minutes and went back to my truck. Over the next few weeks, I started cautiously asking locals about Riverdale Park. Not directly about what I saw, just casual questions about wildlife in the area or if they'd ever experienced anything strange there. Most people had nothing interesting to say, but an older guy who worked at the gas station near my apartment gave me a long look when I mentioned Riverdale. After making sure no one else was in the store, he told me his brother had seen something big while fishing there about 15 years ago. Said his brother wouldn't go back to that spot afterward, not even in broad daylight. Later that summer, I met a retired logger at a barbecue who had worked those woods for decades. After a few beers, the conversation turned to local legends, and I worked up the courage to mention my experience. Instead of laughing, he got quiet and serious. He told me there had been stories about forest people in that area going back to when he was a kid in the 60s. Most locals who spent time in those woods had learned to keep quiet about what they sometimes saw. "Tell that story to the wrong person," he said, "and you'll never live it down in this town." I finished out that summer job and went back to college in the fall. I've worked other jobs since then, but I've never returned to Riverdale Park. I don't know if what I saw was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or whatever you want to call it. I just know it wasn't something that's supposed to exist according to science. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a weird combination of poor visibility, an unusual bear, and an overactive imagination. Then I remember the way it looked at me, that deliberate, intelligent gaze, and the impossible speed with which it moved. No bear moves like that. No human moves like that. I still live in Grays Harbor County, still go hunting, still spend time in the woods, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. And sometimes when I'm in a remote area and the fog rolls in, I get that same feeling I had that morning, that I'm being watched by something that shouldn't exist. So that's my story. Take it or leave it. I know what I saw, even if I can't explain it. And from what I've gathered, I'm not the only one around here who's seen something they can't explain in those woods. Most just don't talk about it. Story 12. I've debated for years whether to share this. Most of you will think I'm crazy or making this up, but I swear on everything I hold dear that every word of this is true. What happened to me 18 years ago at the Cripple Creek mine still haunts me. I've tried therapy. I've tried drinking it away. Nothing helps. Back then, I was 27 and working the graveyard shift at one of the old mines outside Cripple Creek, Colorado. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well enough and suited me fine. I've always been a big guy, 6'5", 220 pounds, and I grew up hunting and hiking these mountains. Nothing in the woods ever scared me, until that night. It was mid-October, crisp and cold like Colorado gets. I remember because my breath was making those little clouds in front of my face as I did my rounds. The graveyard shift was pretty straightforward. Check the equipment, make sure nothing was tampered with, walk the perimeter of certain areas, and report anything unusual. Most nights were dead quiet, except for the normal forest sounds. That night started like any other. I clocked in around 11 p.m., grabbed my flashlight and radio, and checked in with the day shift guy who was leaving. He mentioned something about hearing weird noises near the South Ridge, but figured it was just elk moving through. Nothing unusual for that time of year. The first few hours were normal. I did my paperwork, made coffee, and started my rounds around 1:30 a.m. The mine property was pretty big, several buildings for equipment storage, office spaces, and then the actual mine entrances that were secured. Some parts of the property backed right up against dense forest and rocky outcroppings. Around 3 a.m., I headed to check the East Equipment Building, a standalone structure about a quarter-mile from the main office where I was based. It housed some of the more expensive machinery and was the furthest building from the main complex. I'd made this walk hundreds of times before. The path to the building cut through a small clearing before the trees thickened again on the other side. I remember noticing how quiet it was. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just that heavy silence that sometimes settles in the mountains. Even then, something felt off, but I couldn't place what it was. I reached the equipment building, unlocked it, and did my check. Everything was normal. I signed the log sheet, locked up, and started heading back to my truck, which I'd parked on the far side of the building. That's when I felt it, this overwhelming sense that something was watching me. The hair on my arms stood up, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I shined my flashlight toward the tree line, thinking maybe it was a mountain lion. We get them around here, and while they're dangerous, I knew how to handle myself. The light caught nothing at first as I swept it across the trees. Then I heard it, a sound I still can't properly describe, like a deep, guttural breathing, but mixed with something almost like a growl. It wasn't a bear sound. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't anything I recognized, and I've heard pretty much every animal in these mountains. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. standing just at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by a pine tree but clearly visible, was something. Something huge. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it's a bear standing on its hind legs. But no, bears don't stand that tall, and they don't stand that way. This thing was at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, and it was standing on 2 legs like a person. But it wasn't a person. God, it wasn't a person. Its proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and its shoulders were massive, easily twice as wide as mine. The shape of its head was wrong too, elongated somehow, with a heavy brow ridge that shadowed where its eyes should be. But I could see its eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, 2 yellowish amber orbs staring right at me. What hit me hardest wasn't just its size or shape, it was the feeling it gave off. Pure predatory intent, pure malevolence, like it wasn't just an animal operating on instinct, but something that knew exactly what it was doing. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think clearly. Then it shifted its weight forward slightly, like it was preparing to move toward me, and that broke my paralysis. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run. 1 second I was frozen in place, and the next I was sprinting back to the equipment building, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly get the key in the lock. I remember dropping them, cursing, grabbing them again, and finally getting the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and pushed a heavy metal shelf against it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. I grabbed my radio and tried to call the main office, but we were in a dead zone. The equipment building was in a slight depression that sometimes killed the signal. So I pulled out my cell phone and called my dad. It was almost 3:30 in the morning, but I wasn't thinking straight. When he answered, I couldn't even form coherent sentences at first. I was hyperventilating, crying, and I'm not a crier, never have been. My dad kept asking me what was wrong, if I was hurt, and all I could say was, it wasn't a bear. Oh my God, it was huge. Over and over. Dad told me he and my sister were coming and to stay put. My mom got on the other line and just talked to me, trying to keep me calm while they drove out. I remember sitting with my back against the wall, staring at that door, terrified that whatever was out there would try to get in. At one point, I heard something moving around outside the building. Heavy footsteps circling around, pausing occasionally. Something scraped against the metal siding, like claws or nails dragging across it. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't try the door or the windows. After what felt like forever, but was probably only about 20 minutes, I heard my dad's truck pulling up. The sounds outside stopped. By the time my dad and sister reached the building, whatever it was had disappeared. When they got me to come out, which took some convincing, Dad immediately started looking for tracks or evidence. He found some too, large impressions in the soft ground near where I'd seen the thing. But they weren't clear enough to make out details, just depressions that showed something heavy had been standing there. My dad, being the practical man he is, tried to convince me it was just a bear. They look bigger when they stand up, he kept saying, but I know what bears look like. I've encountered black bears and even the occasional grizzly over the years. This wasn't a bear. My sister was more open to believing me, but even she looked skeptical when I described how tall it was, how it moved, those eyes. The worst part came when we got back to the main office and my supervisor had arrived. Dad took him aside and I overheard him suggesting I might be on drugs. That hurt more than anything. I've never touched drugs in my life, but I could see it in their faces. They thought I was either high, drunk, or having some kind of mental breakdown. I quit that job the next day. Couldn't face going back there, especially not at night. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep without nightmares. I kept seeing those eyes, that silhouette. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced it was in my room, watching me. I tried telling a few other people over the years, but the reactions were always the same. skepticism, concerns about my mental health, or awkward changes of subject. So I stopped talking about it to most people. The only ones who ever listened without judgment were my nephew Jackson and my sister. Even now, 18 years later, I can't talk about that night without my hands starting to shake. Sometimes I have to leave the room when the conversation turns to unexplained encounters or strange creatures. My nephew thinks I saw a Bigfoot or something similar, but I'm not so sure. Whatever I saw that night felt worse somehow, more sinister than just an undiscovered animal. I've researched similar encounters in the area and found a few, not many, but enough to make me feel less crazy. Miners and hikers reporting tall bipedal creatures in the forests around Cripple Creek going back decades. Most of those accounts describe the same feeling of malevolence, the same unnatural silence before an encounter. What haunts me most isn't just what I saw, but the question of what would have happened if I hadn't made it back to that building in time. Sometimes I dream about that, about being too slow, about those long arms reaching for me, about what would have happened next. Those are the nights I still wake up screaming. I've been back to Cripple Creek since then. You can't avoid it entirely living in this area, but I've never gone near that mine again. I can't. Just driving past the access road makes my chest tighten and my palms sweat. I know how this sounds. I know most people reading this will think I'm making it up or that I hallucinated it somehow. But I know what I saw. I was stone cold sober. I wasn't sleep deprived, and I wasn't prone to seeing things that weren't there. Something was in those woods that night. Something that shouldn't exist but does. And the worst part is knowing it's probably still out there. I don't have any profound conclusions or explanations. I just needed to finally put this down somewhere, to share it with people who might understand or who've had similar experiences. If you've seen something like this too, just know you're not alone. And if you work nights in isolated areas in the mountains, be careful. Be very, very careful. Story 13. I've never shared this before because nobody believes me. Not even my cousin Brian, who was right there with me, which still confuses me to this day. But I need to get this off my chest, so here goes. This happened 23 years ago, right before my 10th birthday. I grew up in Lisbon Center, Maine, where my family had this little house at the edge of a huge pine forest. As a kid, those woods were my playground. I knew every trail, every creek, and every fishing spot within a mile radius. My dad and grandpa had taught me to hunt and fish there since I was old enough to hold a rod. It wasn't some unfamiliar place that scared me. These were my woods. It was a Saturday in late October. The air was crisp, but not too cold, and the pine needles made this soft carpet under our feet. My cousin Brian was staying over for the weekend, and after lunch we decided to go exploring. My mum told us not to go far, so we stuck to this well-worn trail that ran about half a mile from our backyard. We were just walking and talking about normal kid stuff, baseball cards, which teacher we hated most, that kind of thing. The forest was quiet that day. Looking back, maybe too quiet. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the leaves. But as kids, we didn't notice that kind of thing. We were maybe 20 minutes into our walk, both of us looking down at the ground as we talked. I remember kicking pine cones as we went. Then something happened that I still can't fully explain. We both stopped. At the exact same moment, mid-sentence, mid-step. It wasn't like we heard something or saw something. It was like our bodies just refused to move forward. Then came this feeling. God, I don't know how to describe it. It was fear, but not like when you watch a scary movie or when you think there's a burglar in your house. This was something primal and overwhelming. My heart didn't just race, it felt like it was trying to tear itself out of my chest. My skin went ice cold, then burning hot. I couldn't breathe right, and the worst part, I couldn't move. Not a muscle, not even to run. It took everything I had just to lift my head and look forward. And there it was, standing not even 2 feet in front of me, just there, silent. No movement, no sound, no warning. How something could get that close without making a sound on a forest floor covered in dry leaves and pine needles, I'll never understand. I couldn't see its face because it was too close. That's what still freaks me out when I think about it. It was just slightly taller than me, maybe 5 feet tall. The first thing I noticed was the hair, long reddish-brown hair that seemed to float slightly even though there wasn't any wind. It moved like hair underwater, slow and drifting. The arms were what made my stomach drop. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Too long, too thin, with joints that didn't bend quite right. I couldn't see below its waist because my vision had tunneled from fear. It's like my brain couldn't process the whole thing at once. The smell is something I'll never forget, like wet leaves and something metallic, almost like blood, but not quite. I don't know how long we stood there frozen. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time stopped making sense. I remember thinking very clearly, I'm going to die. Not as a panic thought, but as a simple fact, as certain as knowing the sun will rise tomorrow. Gradually, the paralysis started to lift, like I was thawing from the inside out. I managed to turn my head, just slightly, to look at Brian. What I saw nearly made me throw up. His face, it wasn't right. It looked stretched, like someone had grabbed his skin and pulled it. His mouth was open way too wide, way wider than a human mouth should be able to open. His eyes were bulging. I don't know if that's what really happened or if my terror-stricken brain was distorting what I saw. When I could finally move my legs, we both turned at the same time and ran. We didn't say a word to each other. We just ran like hell back toward my house. I remember my lungs burning and branches whipping my face, but I didn't care. The physical pain was nothing compared to the fear pushing me forward. We burst into my kitchen, where my mum was making cookies. She took one look at us, sweaty, pale, scratched up from branches, and asked what happened. I started talking a mile a minute, trying to explain. But as I was speaking, I looked at Brian, expecting him to back me up, and he just stared at me with this confused expression. When my mom asked him if what I was saying was true, he said, "What are you talking about? We were just running around playing tag." I couldn't believe it. He was right there. He saw the same thing I did. But the look in his eyes, it wasn't like he was lying. It was like he genuinely had no memory of what happened. That night, I overheard my mom talking to my dad, saying I had an overactive imagination and that I was making up stories again. But I wasn't making anything up. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The next day, I tried talking to Brian alone about it. He got angry and told me to stop making stuff up. He swore we never even went into the woods that day. But I know we did. I still had the scratches on my arms from the branches we ran through. I didn't go back into those woods for months. When I finally did, I never went alone, and never on that particular trail. My parents thought I'd just outgrown playing in the forest, but the truth was, I was terrified of seeing that thing again. What haunts me the most isn't just what I saw. It's the feeling I had, this absolute certainty that if I'd been alone that day, I wouldn't have come back. That thing wouldn't have just stood there. It would have taken me, and no one would have known what happened to me. Over the years, I've read about missing kids in forests, how sometimes they find clothes miles from where the kid was last seen, in places that make no sense, how search parties can walk right past areas and miss things, only to find them when they double back. I think about those stories differently now. I'm 33 now. I've told this story to exactly 3 people in my adult life. My college roommate, who thought I was making it up. My ex-girlfriend, who suggested I'd experienced some kind of shared hallucination. And a therapist, who tried to convince me it was a false memory created by childhood anxiety. But I know what happened that day. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still see those unnaturally moving arms and that floating red hair. I still feel that paralyzing fear crawling up my spine, and I still wonder what would have happened if I'd been alone. The strangest part? Brian and I grew apart after that weekend. We used to be inseparable, but after that day in the woods, he avoided me. At family gatherings, he'd stay on the opposite side of the room. When we did talk, it was awkward and forced. By the time we were teenagers, we were practically strangers. I've always wondered if, deep down, he does remember what happened but can't face it. I moved away from Maine after college and rarely go back. Last year, I had to return for my grandmother's funeral. The drive took me past those same woods. Even from the safety of my car, my heart started racing and my palms got sweaty. 23 years later, and my body still remembers the fear. I've spent countless hours researching local folklore, Native American legends, anything that might explain what we encountered. I've found stories of forest spirits and skinwalkers, but nothing that perfectly matches what I saw. Nothing that explains the paralyzing fear or why Brian can't remember. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back, follow that trail again, and confront whatever's out there. But the truth is, I'm still scared. Not the normal kind of scared, but the deep, primal kind that tells you something is fundamentally wrong, that some things in this world aren't meant to be understood or confronted. All I know for certain is that something was in those woods that day, something that wanted us, or at least me. And the only reason I'm alive to write this is because I wasn't alone. If you're ever hiking in the forests of Maine and suddenly feel an unexplainable dread wash over you, don't try to be brave. Don't try to figure out what's causing it. Just run. Run and don't look back. Because some things once seen never leave you. And some predators don't need claws or teeth to hunt. They just need you to freeze long enough for them to get close. Story 14. I'm only sharing this now because I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. It's been 3 months, and I'm still seeing a therapist about what happened. My co-workers think I'm either crazy, a liar, or was high as a kite that morning. I wasn't. I know what I saw. I know what I hit. And it wasn't a deer, a bear, or any other animal native to Mississippi. I've been an FBI agent for 11 years. I work out of the field office in Jackson, but I was temporarily stationed in Brookhaven for a case that required me to travel to Natchez almost daily. The commute wasn't ideal, about 50 miles one way along Highway 84. It's not a heavily traveled road, especially in the early morning hours when I typically made my drive. Just a 2-lane highway cutting through farmland, patches of dense forest, and the occasional small town. That morning, February 12th, I left my motel at 4 in the morning. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd spoken to my wife the night before about how I'd be home by Friday, and she was counting down the days. 3 more days, she'd said. Just get through Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and you'll be home. The sky was pitch black. No moon, no stars, just darkness, and the occasional reflective sign or mile marker catching my headlights. I had the heat blasting because it was unusually cold for Mississippi in February, somewhere in the high 20s. I remember having my coffee in the cup holder, and I was listening to an audiobook about the Civil War. Nothing unusual, nothing that would mess with my perception or alertness. I'd set the cruise control to between 65 and 70 miles per hour. Traffic was non-existent. I hadn't passed another car in at least 15 minutes. I was somewhere east of Roxy, maybe 5 or 6 miles east. The highway there is straight, with woods on both sides and a grassy median separating eastbound and westbound lanes. That's when I saw it. My headlights caught something moving from the right side of the highway, crossing the eastbound lane toward the median. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as something familiar, a bear maybe, though we don't have many in that part of Mississippi, or possibly a very large man. But within seconds, I realized it was neither. The figure was enormous, not just tall, but massive. It stood upright on 2 legs, walking with purpose. Not running, but moving quickly, its arms swinging naturally at its sides. As it entered the median between the highways, I got a better look. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, taller than the road sign it passed. It was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. Not black, more of a deep dark brown that absorbed my headlights rather than reflected them. I couldn't make out facial features, just a large, somewhat conical head set directly on broad shoulders. No neck that I could discern. Its arms hung lower than a human's would, probably reaching mid-thigh. The proportions were all wrong for a person, even an exceptionally tall one. I know how this sounds. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, wondering if I was hallucinating or if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I wasn't tired. I wasn't impaired. I was alert and functioning normally, and what I saw was real. Here's where I made my mistake. Instead of slamming on the brakes immediately, I kept driving, fixed on this thing as it moved toward my lane. It's like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing, so my body just continued on autopilot. The creature and I were on a collision course, and I was doing nothing to prevent it. When it was about 30 feet from my lane, the thing seemed to notice my car. It turned its head toward me, just slightly, and then did something I still have nightmares about. It dropped down onto all fours. Not like it fell, but like it was intentionally changing its stance to move faster. Even on all fours, its back was higher than the hood of my Toyota Camry. Then it accelerated. It was like watching a freight train barreling toward me, but with the fluid movement of a predator. In that moment, I finally reacted. I hit the brakes hard and swerved to the right, but it was too late. The impact was unlike anything I've ever experienced. The creature's head or shoulder hit my driver's side headlight with such force that my car immediately began to spin. As it did, the creature's body collided with my rear door and fender. The sound was horrific, not the typical crunch of metal you'd expect from hitting a deer. It was a heavy, solid thud, followed by a scraping that vibrated through the entire vehicle. My car spun completely around, a full 360 degrees, before coming to rest facing eastbound, the direction I'd come from. The airbags hadn't deployed, which still puzzles me given the force of the impact. My coffee had splashed all over the inside of the windshield, and my audiobook was still playing as if nothing had happened. For several seconds, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to process what had just occurred. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the narrator calmly discussing the Battle of Vicksburg. I reached over and shut it off. The highway was silent, no other cars, no sound of the creature moving away or moaning in pain. Nothing, just the ticking of my damaged engine cooling down and my own labored breathing. I should have stayed put. That's protocol. If you hit something, you stop, assess the damage and report it. But in that moment, all I could think about was getting away from whatever that thing was. What if it wasn't injured? What if it came back? The thought of facing that creature again, possibly angry and hurt, overrode my training. I tried to start the car. It took 3 attempts before the engine turned over. The front end was making a horrible grinding noise, and the check engine light was glaring at me from the dashboard. My headlight was completely shattered on the driver's side, and when I put the car in drive, it shuddered violently. But it moved. I limped that car about a mile down the road before pulling onto the shoulder. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate my phone. I called my supervisor in DC, not the local office. I don't know why, maybe because I knew how it would sound to someone who hadn't seen what I'd seen. "I hit something on Highway 84, I told him when he answered, his voice groggy with sleep. "Something big." "A deer?" he asked, the obvious assumption. "No," I said. "Much bigger. It was walking upright. Then it went down on all fours." I couldn't bring myself to say what I was thinking, that I'd hit a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Wilkinson, are you injured?" he finally asked. "No, sir." "Have you been drinking?" "No, sir. I was heading to Natchez for the Spencer case." Another long pause. "Where are you now?" I gave him my approximate location. "Stay there. I'm calling the local office to send someone out. And Wilkinson, you're going to need a drug and alcohol test when you get back." I wasn't surprised. I would have ordered the same if I'd received such a call, but it didn't make it any less humiliating. I sat in my damaged car for almost 45 minutes before a state trooper arrived, followed shortly by 2 agents from the Brookhaven Resident Agency. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows through the trees lining the highway. The trooper took one look at my car and let out a low whistle. "You hit something big, all right." The damage was extensive. The driver's side headlight was completely gone. The hood was crumpled on that side. The most severe damage, though, was to the rear driver's side door and quarter panel, which were caved in at least 8 inches. Whatever I'd hit had impacted with tremendous force, enough to spin a 3,000-pound car completely around. "Let's go back to where it happened," one of the agents suggested. We drove back in the trooper's car, me directing them to the approximate location of the impact. The morning light revealed no blood, no fur, no evidence whatsoever of what I'd hit. We searched the median and both sides of the highway for about 100 yards in each direction. Nothing. "Maybe it ran off into the woods," the trooper suggested. I didn't respond. We both knew that anything hit with enough force to do that kind of damage to a car shouldn't have been able to run off anywhere. The drug and alcohol tests came back negative, of course. My car was towed to a body shop in Brookhaven, where the mechanic told me it would cost more to repair than the vehicle was worth. Insurance covered it as a collision with an animal, but my deductible was still $2,000 out of pocket. The real cost, though, has been to my reputation and my peace of mind. Word got around fast. By lunchtime, everyone at the office had heard about Wilkinson's Bigfoot. The joke started immediately. Someone put a stuffed gorilla on my desk. Another agent started making exaggerated footprints whenever he walked past me. My supervisor called me into his office that afternoon. "The tests came back clean," he said, "so we can rule out substances." "I told you I wasn't on anything." "That leaves us with a few possibilities," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Either you fell asleep at the wheel and don't remember it correctly, you had some kind of hallucination, or I saw what I saw." I finished for him. He leaned back in his chair. "Look, Gary, you're a good agent, solid record, no disciplinary issues. I'm not going to put anything in your file about this. As far as the Bureau is concerned, you hit a deer or a bear that wandered off. But between us, get some rest. Maybe talk to someone. Stress can do strange things to the mind." I nodded, knowing there was no point in arguing. I knew what I saw, what I hit, and it wasn't a deer or a bear. Only one person has taken me seriously. Agent Mills from the Cyber Division. She sought me out a week after it happened, asked me to describe everything in detail. When I finished, she didn't laugh or look at me like I was crazy. "My uncle had a similar experience in Oregon back in 1987, she told me. No one believed him either. That's why I'm writing this now. Because maybe someone out there has seen what I saw. Maybe someone will believe me. I've spent my career dealing in facts, evidence, things that can be proven. But I have no evidence for this, just the memory of those moments on Highway 84, the impact that nearly totaled my car, and the absence of any rational explanation. I'm back in Jackson now. I requested a transfer back to headquarters. Couldn't face making that drive again. I've started taking a longer route to work that avoids wooded areas. I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at 3 in the morning, I wonder if that thing was real. How many more are out there? And what happens when someone else encounters one on a dark, lonely stretch of highway? Story 15. I still can't explain what we saw that night in the Davis Mountains. It's been 46 years now, and I've told this story to exactly 5 people, besides the 2 who were with me. 3 of them laughed it off. One thought I was drunk, and one just nodded and said his cousin saw something similar near Guadalupe Mountains in the 80s. I've never posted about this online before, but I'm getting older and I figure someone should know. It was October 12th, 1977. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week after my 31st birthday. I was driving my semi back from El Paso to Midland. I'd been hauling industrial equipment out west and was heading home with an empty trailer. My buddy Mike had blown the transmission in his Chevy Nova near Valentine, and I'd agreed to tow it back to Midland, where his brother-in-law could fix it cheap. Mike had called me from a payphone in Valentine, this tiny speck of a town. His girlfriend Diane was with him, and they were stranded. The nearest proper garage wanted $300 just to look at the car, which was money none of us had to spare in those days. I was passing through the area anyway, so I told him I'd swing by with a tow chain. We hooked up his Nova to my rig around 4 in the afternoon. Mike and Diane piled into my cab, and we set off eastbound on Highway 90, planning to pick up 17 north through the Davis Mountains. It's the most direct route back to Midland, but it cuts through some of the emptiest country in Texas. The first couple hours were uneventful. Mike brought a six-pack, and we caught up while Diane dozed off in the passenger seat. Mike was squeezed in the small space, behind the seats. We hadn't seen each other in months, so we had plenty to talk about. Jobs, mutual friends, the Cowboys' chances that season. Normal stuff. The sun set around 6:30. There's something about the way darkness falls in West Texas. It doesn't creep in gradually like in other places. 1 minute, you've got this blood-red sun hitting the mountains, and the next it's just gone, like someone flipped a switch. The darkness out there is absolute. No streetlights, no glow from nearby towns, nothing but stars when they're out. That night, there weren't many stars. A storm had blown through earlier, and thick clouds hung low, blocking most of the moonlight. The air had that after-rain smell, all dust and creosote. My headlights cut through the darkness, showing maybe 50 feet of empty road ahead, wet asphalt reflecting the beams back at us. We were about 30 miles north of Alpine, deep in the Davis Mountains. If you've never been through there, it's hard to describe how isolated it feels. The road twists through these ancient volcanic hills covered in scrub and cactus. During the day, it's beautiful in a stark, wind-swept way. At night, it's like driving on another planet. I had to slow down to about 35 miles per hour on those curves, especially with Mike's Nova in tow. The road was slick from the rain, and I didn't want to jackknife or slide off into a ravine. The tires hummed on the wet pavement, and the wipers squeaked across the windshield, clearing the occasional drizzle that still fell. Around 8:15, we rounded a bend, and my headlights swept across something at the edge of the road. At first glance, I thought it was a large saguaro cactus. You know, one of those tall ones with arms. Except saguaros don't grow in the Davis Mountains. My brain was still processing this when Mike leaned forward between the seats. "What the hell is that?" he said, pointing toward the roadside. I slowed down even more and flipped on my high beams. That's when I saw it move. What I'd thought was a cactus turned its head away from the light. My stomach dropped. I'm not exaggerating when I say I felt ice water in my veins. The thing was standing maybe 15 feet off the shoulder. As we drew closer, I could make out more details, and each one made less sense than the last. It was tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its head was massive and oddly shaped, almost too big for its body. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but its eyes caught the light and reflected it back like a deer's or cat's eyes do, except much larger and spaced wider apart. The body was stooped forward, with shoulders that hunched up almost to its ears. Its arms hung down past its knees, way longer than any human arms should be, and it was covered in this thick, matted hair or fur that moved slightly in the breeze. Diane woke up when Mike spoke and let out a small gasp. "Connor, what is that thing?" she whispered. I couldn't answer her. My mouth had gone completely dry. As we pulled alongside it, all three of us turned to look out the passenger window. The thing turned its head to follow our movement. That's when our eyes met, mine and this creature's. There was an awareness there, an intelligence that made my skin crawl. It wasn't like looking at an animal. It was like it knew we were seeing it, and it was seeing us right back. The smell hit us then. Even with the windows up, this overwhelming stench seeped into the cab. It was like rotting garbage mixed with something musky and wild. Worse than any roadkill I've ever smelled. Diane covered her mouth and nose with her hand. Mike muttered something that might have been a prayer. I didn't speed up immediately. Some stupid part of my brain wanted to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The thing remained perfectly still as we passed, just watching us with those reflective eyes. It made no move to approach the truck or the road. It just stood there, observing. Once it was behind us, I finally hit the gas. The transmission whined as I pushed it harder than I should have with the car in tow. "Did you see that?" Mike's voice was higher than normal. "Tell me you both saw that." "I saw it," Diane said quietly. She was pressed against the door, as far from the window as she could get. "It was probably just a bear," I said, not believing it for a second. "There are black bears in the Davis Mountains, but they don't stand 8 feet tall on their hind legs, and they don't have heads that big or arms that long. That was no bear, Connor." Mike leaned forward again, his face appearing between the seats. "Bears don't look at you like that, like they know something." We drove in silence for a few minutes. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the thing lumbering down the road after us. The rational part of my brain was already trying to make sense of what we'd seen. A man in a costume, out here, miles from anywhere, a deformed bear or some other animal, nothing fit. "We should report it," Diane finally said, "when we get to Fort Davis or somewhere with a sheriff's office." "And tell them what?" I replied. "That we saw Bigfoot in the Davis Mountains? They'll breathalyze me and impound my rig." "It wasn't Bigfoot," Mike said firmly. "Bigfoot's supposed to be in the Pacific Northwest, in forests. I don't know what this is." We argued about it for the next 20 miles or so. Mike wanted to turn around and go back with a camera. I thought that was about the stupidest idea I'd ever heard. Diane just wanted to get to somewhere with other people and lights. In the end, we didn't report it. We stopped at a truck stop outside Fort Davis, where an old payphone sat near the restrooms. We stood there staring at it for a good 5 minutes before Mike said, "What would we even say?" He was right. We had no evidence, just a story that sounded crazy even to us, and we'd seen the damn thing. So we bought coffee, used the bathrooms, and got back on. The road. None of us slept for the rest of the drive. We made it to Midland around 2 in the morning. I dropped Mike and Diane at his apartment and continued onto the trucking yard to park my rig. I sat in the cab for a long time after I shut off the engine, just staring into the darkness, replaying what I'd seen over and over. The next day, we met up at Mike's place and made a pact. We wouldn't tell anyone what we'd seen unless all 3 of us agreed. It seemed important somehow, like we'd witnessed something we weren't supposed to, something that existed in the spaces between what we know is real and what can't possibly exist. Over the years, we'd bring it up when we got together. "Remember that thing in the Davis Mountains?" one of us would say, and we'd go through it all again, comparing details, making sure our memories matched. They always did. The height, the shape, those eyes, that smell. We all remembered exactly the same thing. I drove through the Davis Mountains dozens of times after that night. I always slowed down at that curve, always looked for it. I never saw it again. Part of me was relieved, but another part wanted confirmation that I hadn't imagined it, that there was something out there in those ancient hills that science hasn't catalogued. Mike passed away in 2009. Lung cancer. Before he died, he made me promise to break our pact if I ever found evidence of what we saw. "People should know," he said. "We weren't crazy, Connor." Diane moved to Arizona in the 80s. Last I heard, she was working as a nurse in Phoenix. I haven't spoken to her in over a decade, but I still have her brother's phone number somewhere. I'm 67 now. I retired from trucking 5 years ago after my back gave out. I've had plenty of time to research what we might have seen. There are stories from the Apache about tall creatures they call mountain spirits that live in the high desert. The Mexican vaqueros had legends about the big person of the night that would watch travelers from the shadows. Maybe that's what we encountered, or maybe it was something else entirely. Something that has no name because so few people have seen it and lived to tell about it. Something that knows how to stay hidden in a world where humans have mapped and catalogued nearly everything. I still can't explain what we saw that night. I don't know if it was a known animal, some undiscovered species, or something stranger still. All I know is that for a few seconds, on a rainy October night in 1977, 3 ordinary people saw something extraordinary standing by the side of a lonely road in the Davis Mountains of Texas. And whatever it was, it saw us too. Story 16. I've never told this story properly before. I'm still not sure I can explain what happened that night, but maybe writing it down will help make sense of it. It's been 53 years, and I still wake up sometimes hearing that sound in my nightmares. It was the summer of 1970, late June. I was 18, had just graduated high school, and was enjoying that magical summer before college when everything feels possible. I had finally worked up the courage to ask Rebecca Carter on a date. She was this beautiful girl with auburn hair who lived a few blocks over. We'd known each other since elementary school, but I'd always been too shy to make a move. That night was perfect. Warm but not too hot, clear skies, and just enough moonlight to see without needing a flashlight. I picked her up in my 1962 Chevy convertible, my pride and joy that I'd spent 2 summers working at my uncle's garage to buy. We went to a drive-in movie first. I think it was Airport, but honestly can't remember now. And afterward, neither of us wanted the night to end. So I suggested Lookout Point in Stone State Park. It wasn't exactly original. It was where all the local kids went to park. The spot overlooked the Big Sioux River, right at the border between Iowa and South Dakota. During the day, the view was incredible. You could see for miles across the rolling farmlands. At night, it was peaceful and private. When we arrived around 11:30, there was only one other car there, another couple with their top down, enjoying the summer night. I drove to the far end of the parking area to give us both some privacy. The night was gorgeous, with stars scattered across the sky and the moon hanging low. You could hear the gentle sound of the river below and the occasional rustling in the trees from the light breeze. I suggested we spread a blanket out a little ways from the car to enjoy the view better. Rebecca agreed, and we walked about 35 meters from the parking lot, finding a nice grassy spot that overlooked the river valley. The 200-acre park had hiking trails throughout, but this particular area was open, with woods on one side and the view of the water on the other. The moonlight was just enough that we could see each other and the general surroundings without being too exposed. It was one of those perfect summer moments, crickets chirping, the smell of grass and wildflowers, and the excitement of being alone with someone you're crazy about. We laid back on the blanket, looking up at the stars, talking about what we wanted to do after summer. Rebecca was headed to University of Iowa, and I was going to Iowa State. We were trying not to talk about how we'd be at different schools in a few months. We'd been there maybe 15 minutes. Nothing serious was happening. Just some innocent kissing, holding hands, that kind of thing. I remember Rebecca had just laughed at something I said when it happened. The scream came from the woods beside us. I've spent decades trying to find the right words to describe that sound, but nothing really captures it. It was like a woman's scream, but impossibly, unnaturally loud. It wasn't just the volume that was terrifying. It was the quality of it. It was primal, raw, and filled with a kind of fury I'd never heard before or since. It didn't sound like an animal, but it didn't sound entirely human either. Rebecca and I both froze. I remember her fingers digging into my arm so hard they left marks. For a split second, we just stared at each other in total shock. Then the scream came again, closer this time. That's when we both scrambled to our feet. We left everything, the blanket, Rebecca's purse, my jacket. We just ran. The distance back to the car suddenly seemed endless. I could hear Rebecca breathing hard beside me, and I grabbed her hand as we sprinted across the grass. The whole time, I had this overwhelming feeling that something was right behind us. I couldn't hear footsteps exactly, but there was this sense of movement, of something large keeping pace with us just at the edge of the trees. The screaming continued, 3, maybe 4 times as we ran. Each time it sounded closer, each time it seemed to be aimed directly at us. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like whatever was making that sound was specifically trying to terrify us. And it was working. I remember seeing the other couple in their car suddenly sit up and look in our direction with alarmed expressions. I wanted to yell to them to start their car, to get out of there, but I couldn't catch enough breath to speak. When we reached my Chevy, we didn't even open the doors properly. We just vaulted over the sides into the seats. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Rebecca was saying something, crying, I think, but the blood was pounding so hard in my ears I couldn't make out her words. The engine started on the first try, thank God. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel. As I was backing up, I caught movement at the edge of the tree line in my headlights, just a shadow really, but large and upright. It was there and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure what I'd seen, but whatever it was big, much bigger than a person. I remember the other couple had already started their car and were pulling out ahead of us. I spun the wheel and floored it down that winding park road, taking the curves way too fast, the tires squealing. Rebecca was pressed against the passenger door, looking back over her shoulder the entire time, her face pale in the moonlight. The whole drive back to town, we barely spoke. What could we say? Neither of us had any explanation for what we'd experienced. When I dropped her off at her house, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Let's not tell anyone about this. They'll think we're crazy." I agreed, though part of me wanted to go straight to the police or park rangers or someone who might have answers. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream again. The next day, I worked up the courage to go back to Lookout Point in broad daylight to retrieve our things. I half expected everything to be gone, but the blanket was there, along with Rebecca's purse and my jacket, undisturbed. There were no unusual tracks that I could see, no evidence of anything strange, just our abandoned belongings lying in the grass. Rebecca and I went out a few more times that summer, but things were different between us. We never talked about what happened, but it was always there, unspoken between us. When August came, she left for college early, and our relationship just kind of faded away. I sometimes wonder if she still thinks about that night, if she still hears that scream in her dreams like I do. For years I didn't tell anyone who would believe me, but the experience changed something in me. I developed this strange sixth sense about certain things, particularly about babies and children being in danger. I can't explain it rationally, but there have been several times in my life when I've had overwhelming urges to check on my kids at night, only to find them tangled in blankets and struggling to breathe, or the time I suddenly felt compelled to run to the community pool where my daughter was swimming, arriving just in time to pull her out when she went under. It wasn't until August of 1974, 4 years later, that I came across a small article in the local paper about strange sightings in Stone State Park. A hiker claimed to have seen a creature approximately 3.5 meters tall, accompanied by what appeared to be a larger adult, about 7 meters tall. The article was buried on page 8, treated as a joke, really. But when I read it, my blood ran cold. It hit me then. What if what we encountered that night wasn't human at all? What if it was a female? I hesitate to use the word Bigfoot because it sounds ridiculous, but I don't know what else to call it. What if she was traveling with her young offspring and our presence startled her? What if those screams were a warning, a mother protecting her baby? The more I've thought about it over the decades, the more this explanation makes sense to me. The scream sounded female. It was territorial and threatening. We weren't attacked. We were warned away, and somehow that experience gave me a heightened awareness when it comes to protecting young ones. I'm 71 years old now. I've had a good life, marriage, kids, grandkids, a career. But that night at Lookout Point has never left me. Sometimes, when I'm hiking or camping, I'll stop and listen to the woods, half expecting to hear that scream again. I never have, thank God. I don't know if anyone will believe this account. I'm not sure I would if I hadn't lived it. But it happened exactly as I've described it. And somewhere out there, Rebecca remembers it too. Whatever was in those woods that night changed us both forever. Some things you can't explain. Some encounters leave marks on your soul that never fade. That scream, that impossible, terrifying scream, is one of them. And even now, 53 years later, I still find myself avoiding wooded areas after dark, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, certain that something is watching me from just beyond the edge of the trees.